of inquiry into the Hazelwood mine fire is now in session.
Before I call the next witness, there is one bundle of documents that have been provided to the inquiry by GDF Sewers, which I would seek to tender. It's a bundle of documents entitled Safety Assessment of Major Mining Hazards, and it comes in several stages, several parts, and I understand from, and includes an executive summary. I understand from Ms Doyle that there is a further folder of documents that may be sought to be attached to this exhibit. I'm perhaps not expressing that as well as I could, but that's my understanding. So for the time being, if I could tender this bundle, and copies have been provided to the parties.
Exhibit 89.
Thank you, Your Honour. With that out of the way, I would call Mr Richard Polmere to the witness box, please.
Please state your full name.
Richard Matthew Polmere.
Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Afternoon, Mr Polmere.
Afternoon.
Can you confirm for the transcript, please, that your full name is Richard Matthew Polmere
It is.
and you're employed by Hazelwood Power Corporation, or GDF Sewers, as it's been referred to in this inquiry, as its Carbon Efficiency and Improvement General Manager?
I am.
I'm guessing that's a title that didn't exist in 1982 when you started working at this location.
You did right.
Mr Polmere, for the purposes of the inquiry, have you made a witness statement recently of 30 paragraphs plus attachments?
I have.
Yep. And have you, before coming along this afternoon, had an opportunity to read through that statement?
I have.
And are its contents true and correct?
To the best of my knowledge.
Yes, nothing you want to change?
No.
I tender the statement, please.
Yes, exhibit 90.
A little bit about you, Mr Polmere, and your position. You have, in fact, been employed at the Hazelwood mine for a considerable period of time, since 1982.
Correct.
Must make you one of the veterans at the location, I'm guessing.
Correct.
And obviously you were there when the mine was operated by the SECV, and you've been there through the Generation Victoria period and continued post-privatisation.
Correct.
During that period of 32 years, you've had a number of roles which you refer to in paragraph 4 of your statement, including a recent period as the mine director, 2010 to 2012.
Correct.
And importantly, you've held 2 positions where you had a responsibility for fire services at the mine. Is that right? As I read it, between 1990 and 1994, albeit in 2 different positions, you had that responsibility.
That's correct.
Now, we have an organisation chart. You might have been in the inquiry room when Mr Faithful found a younger version of himself on a photo. We'll ask you to do the same if we could, please, to get some idea of where you're located in the hierarchy. If you use that ruler that's just in front of you, please, Mr Polmere, and point at the large screen, if you wouldn't mind.
I do. I'm not sure that I'm on it.
That was not the outcome I was looking for, Mr Polmere. It's never a good sign.
Can I tell you I'm retiring in 2 weeks? So maybe
I think you might have retired.
I report directly to the asset manager, Mr Graham.
Mr Graham, okay. Not through anyone else, obviously enough. It's a direct report.
Yep.
All right, that'll do. Thank you.
This might be published in 2 weeks' time.
All right. Now, very helpfully, I must say, for the inquiry, Mr Polmere, you have been able to fill a number of gaps, and we're grateful for that. Your statement sets out a good deal of history going back even before the mine commenced, before there was a commencement of coal mining. You refer us to a plan which is behind attachment 1. That might be a useful place to start. Annexure 1, I should say. And if we orient that so that, if we can turn it counterclockwise 90 degrees, please. Now north's at the top, isn't it?
Pretty close, Mr.
Olmy? Pretty close. For our purposes, we've got. This, as you tell us, is actually from a book, isn't it? It's the proposed mine, January 1951.
That's correct.
And just to get an understanding of that, we're looking at the eastern end of what we've all been referring to as the Northern Batters.
Yes, this
Is that
is
right?
the original workings of the mine. You will see have a curve in it.
Yes.
Which is the only, well, not the only, but it's quite helpful in terms of locating yourself. At that stage, the mine was set up to supply energy, what we now know as energy bricks.
Yes.
And that was the northern batters of the east field and the eastern batters of the east field.
Yes. And we can see the conveyor there, can we, linking the eastern batters
Yes,
with
the fixed conveyor.
with the
At
energy
that stage
bricks?
it was all rail transport, so
Yes.
these loops show the rail corridors.
Okay.
Rail
And if we can just zoom back, I think is what I mean, reduce the size, then we can, to the north of the Northern Batters, we can see the southern parts of Morwell.
Yeah.
And we can, in fact, just see the railway line, can't we, at the top there?
Victorian rail line.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
There's dual linkages into the UCC's rail.
Yes. Now, you explain in your statement the development of the mine through the 1950s and the 1960s. We don't need to go into any great detail other than to note that during that time, once the power station to the south of the mine came into operation, there was a significant increase in the amount of coal that was being mined in a given year.
For putting that statement and a couple of other statements in there was to give an indication that the development of fire service
Yes.
in that northeastern corner was actually, it appears quite haphazard.
Yes.
When you look at plans that showed the outline there, and it was...
Why was that? Well, why is that?
Three factors.
Yes.
One was the development of the mine. So the mine was initially going to be rail transport and bucket chain machines, subsequently moved to bucket wheels and conveyors. A developing mine always has to open up a reasonably large area and then develop down the next level, develop that out. So the point which is deepest is changing all the time, which
Yes.
means that you've got problems in pipe work to get the water out, things like that. That's changing quite frequently. So you end up with a lot of pipe work, which sometimes might go in as a discharge line and then be linked into a fire service network and things like that. So it makes it quite haphazard. And also it predates corrosion protection systems to a large degree.
That's a point you make at paragraph 12 of your statement, is it not?
Jumping about a bit.
That's all right. You're making the point that the pipework installed in that early period was pipework that had little or no internal or external corrosion protection, and subsequent pipework was installed with such protection. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as you explain the reasons, but essentially the pipework over time rusts and becomes, in various degrees, unusable.
Well, the first step is it starts to leak.
Yes.
Leakage is important because leakage tends to get into the pre-existing jointing systems in the coal. Coal doesn't weigh very much more than water.
Yes.
So it doesn't have a lot of capacity to resist water. And as a result of that, movement happens quite rapidly with ingress of water.
Yes.
So leaking pipes create ingress of water, which create instability.
Go. Just tell me if you're finished and I'll ask another question.
Ask another question.
All right. You say in paragraph 16 of your statement that that gradual deterioration in the quality of the pipework, particularly in the area we're talking about, the Northern Batters area, necessitated repairs, including repairs by welding, and that in turn created a fire risk from the welding work. Is that
Yes,
right?
That's correct.
And you say that you can recall in 1992, this is paragraph 19 of your statement, reviewing some records of fires that had occurred in the, particularly the worked out areas of the mine, and noting that a number of those were in fact resulted from welding. Is that right?
Particularly in that area that we're talking about, the Northern
Yes.
Batters area,
Yep.
predominantly were a result of the attempted repairs to the pipes.
Yes, and without taking you to it now, but I will in a moment, the risk assessment report that you attach to your statement includes as a schedule a list of
That's right.
fires that had occurred, I think, in the 3 years prior to when it was prepared in 1992.
Yep.
And is that the list of fires that you're thinking of?
I had
You
access
had your
to
own-
the source documents at that
Right.
point. That is a summary.
That's a summary. You had the actual incident reports, if
Yes.
that's the right description. I understand.
Fire reports, I think we call them.
Okay. Now, you make the point at paragraph 18 that this got to a point where the pipes could no longer hold pressure, and so your option was to remove them and use them as drainage pipes where pressure is not an issue. Is that right?
For larger diameter
Yes.
pipes, that's correct.
Yeah. And the smaller diameter pipes couldn't be used as drainage pipes. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. In 1992, during the period when the 1984 fire protection policy was in place, that's the time that we talked about earlier, that you were responsible for fire protection.
Yep.
And you explain in your statement at paragraph 23 that as a result of these problems with the ageing pipework, the SEC, through you, sought a risk assessment to be done on whether the SEC could be exempted from the requirements in the Fire Protection Code, which dealt with the requirements for fire protection in worked out areas of the mine. Have I got that right? And just so that we're talking about the same thing, you attach that Fire Protection Code, the one that came into effect in 1984 and was in effect until it was replaced in 1994. Have I got the timing right?
Yep.
We find that behind attachment 2 of your statement.
That's correct.
Perhaps if we can go to that, and particularly page numbers are at the top of the page. Page 3. Helpfully there's more than one page 3 in this document, but we'll get to the right one. It's section 1.1.4, so that's the contents page. If we just keep scrolling down, introduction, that's page 1, page 2, plan of protection, and then the next page, and just down the bottom of that page, please. We just stop there for a moment. That's the part of the then code that you are referring to, and for which the risk assessment was asked to consider whether you could have an exemption from that requirement.
From that and the following clause, 1.15.
Yes, so we just go through those. 1.1.4 dealt with worked out batters, and 1.1.5 dealt with the worked out floor, the horizontal area, if I can call it that. And if we can just go back up, to the start of 1.1.4, we see there words that then recur in subsequent iterations of this document, don't we? As a minimum requirement, worked out batters are to be protected as follows. As you note in your statement, what changes is the bit after the as follows. The rules change and the
Yes.
alternatives change. But do you agree that throughout the entire period from 1984 to the present day, it's always expressed as a minimum requirement, is it not?
I'd have to check that to
All
make
right.
sure that the other document is consistent with that, but I suspect you're right.
I'll stand corrected, but we'll go to the other document in a moment if that's all right, Mr. Palmier. It was, we can see that the first two provisions of this code deal with benches and booms, so that's the more horizontal part of the batters. And then the next part, second dot point at the top of... No, sorry, it's the next page. We just stop there. So we see the first paragraph there deals with berms. The second is fire break zones extending down to full depth of batter should be established so that the length of exposed coal in any one batter is not greater than 500 metres. Can you explain to us what the rationale behind that is in terms of fire prevention? Is that to confine a fire that occurs to one zone?
My understanding is that it was a concept, and you'll see it in other areas of the codes where wetted areas that you're meant to create paddocks.
Yes.
So that a fire can only get so big.
Yeah,
it can be. That's the concept behind it.
Yes. We did, just whilst we're on that topic, we did see, I think it was either the evidence of Mr Shanahan or Mr Major, colleagues of yours, earlier in the inquiry. There was a photo that showed what was effectively a waterfall running down the Northern Batters. This is on the 9th of February this year, which seemed to show that I think it was east of the waterfall there was fire, but west of the waterfall there wasn't. Now, I know this is not talking about waterfalls, but that would seem to suggest that fire breaks in a general sense can operate to confine fire to a particular area. Are you familiar with the photo that I'm talking about at all?
No, I'm
No.
not.
And were you at the mine on the 9th of February?
Not on the 9th. No.
All right. I need to pursue that with you. If we go back to this document, we see the final dot point there, the final main dot point. Alternatively, fixed spray brakes it's been a long 3 weeks, may be used, but it should be noted that water for these sprays has not been included under the maximum demand conditions, and it goes on. What specifically was the Commission seeking exemption from there? Was it the requirement to put in fire break zones? Was it the requirement to put in water? What was the concern?
If we go back a little bit,
Yes.
The fire protection policy originally came out of the outworkings of a 1977 fire at the Morwell open cut.
Yes.
And I believe it was first published in 1981. At that stage, there were no worked-out batters at the Hazelwood mine.
Yes.
There was no Loyang mine. The only mine that had worked-out batters was the Lawn mine. The Lawn mine is physically quite different to the Hazelwood mine. It's nowhere near as deep, and the batter profiles are generally much flatter. The bench widths remain similar.
Yes.
Because it's not as deep. It gives an overall slope which is flatter than the Hazelwood mine. The Hazelwood mine is much steeper.
Yes.
And deeper. The overall slope, except for right in the northeastern corner, which was developed by trains, where it's quite that circular effect, the slopes are actually quite flat, so it's quite easy to do the rehabilitation in there, which is why you've seen rehabilitation targeted for that area.
Yes.
As you go further to the west, the overall slope becomes 3-to-1, as my colleague was talking before. So it's 3 horizontal, 1 vertical. The individual slopes are 1-to-1, and then when you take into the account the berms, the overall slope from top to bottom is 3-to-1.
I'll just stop you there for a moment. You're talking about the Northern Batters.
I'm talking about the Northern Batters.
And you're talking about the 1-to-1 is vertical. Is that right?
No.
No.
One horizontal, 1
Yes.
vertical is
45 degrees, I'm sorry.
That's the batter profile, the
Yes.
individual batter profile. Then you have benches,
Yes.
which are flat. Fair enough?
Yes.
So that the batter is effectively made up of a number of sections which are 1-to-1, flat, 1-to-1, flat, 1-to-1, flat.
Yes.
The overall slope from top to bottom is 1 vertical, 3 horizontal.
Yes.
For maintenance of clay berms, the clay, if it's put down, it will grow grass, it will grow trees, shrubs, whatever. If you wish to be able to get onto that slope safely using plant, it needs to be 3 horizontal, 1 vertical, pretty much.
Yes.
So if you apply the proposal as proposed in this document, which worked in concept at your lawn, doesn't work physically at Hazelwood, because the overall slope is 3-to-1. that would mean it would be one continuous slope from top to bottom, which means you've lost all access, you've lost any possible corridors for easements and the like. So the only way that you can cure that, which is what Mr. Faithful was saying earlier, is the toe is the toe. You actually have to go back further at the top to flatten it so that you've got access on benches. If you do that, then you actually have problems with the services that run at the top of those. So at that critical point, just round the corner from where we've done rehab, it steepens up from about 6 to 1 to 3 to 1 overall slope. If you apply this rule at 500 metre intervals and you put the dirt in, then you end up with paddocks, but paddocks which are now inaccessible from top to bottom. So if a fire does get in there, you can't get in to fight it. And
sorry, maybe just me, Mr. Palmier, why is it inaccessible if you put in the fire breaks?
Because the material, so we've got our bench and our 1-to-1 slope, for that height, you have to fill the entire bench width. There is now no access along there.
Yes.
And if you do that from top to bottom, like it says, it's one continuous slope from top to bottom, with no ability to get into those paddocked areas. So if you have a fire, or if you want to do rehabilitation, you can't physically get in there to do it.
Does that mean then that for practical purposes, whilst these rules were in play, the alternative of fixed spray brakes was really the only option that was available at Hazelwood?
Yes.
And therefore it's from that obligation that the exemption was being explored?
Well,
both of them?
Both of them,
yes.
really.
All right. What about 1.1.5? You've told us we can just scroll down to work out the floor of the open cut. Is this the requirement for what you've referred to as paddocking? Have I understood that correctly? 1.1.5 requires the floor of the worked out floor to be divided into zones.
Yeah, look, 1.1.5 from my recollection, and it is more than 20 years ago now, wasn't the major concern.
Right, it was the
1.1.4.
Okay. The Commission asked for a risk analysis to be done, a fire risk analysis to be done, in order that this issue could be explored, whether an exemption from the requirements for the Hazelwood mine would be appropriate in terms of continuing fire protection.
Yes.
Is that right? And you have attached a copy of that risk assessment behind attachment 3 of your statement. I'd like to go to that. You may or may not know, but the inquiry has been inquiring of your employer on a number of occasions for any copies of any risk assessments that have been done, so we're very grateful that this one has been provided to us.
Can I just say that at the time that this was done,
yes.
risk assessment, the concept of risk assessment was relatively new.
Yes.
I think at about 1990 I attended the inaugural APSMA training on risk assessment that was done, so this was actually pretty much cutting edge.
Bit of pioneering work. Okay. No longer a new concept though, you'd have to concede.
No,
right. Now, solicitors for GDF Sewers provided us with a draft copy of this document under cover of a letter last week, and it's actually now included in Exhibit 80. We don't need to go to that, but it includes a covering letter that was addressed to you, providing you with a draft of the document, asking you to check it for accuracy before it was finalised. Does that? I don't know if you can remember that, but are you aware that a draft copy of that report was provided to us? You've seen that. And are you able to tell us, I've had a quick look, there seem to be some changes between the draft and the final document that you provided. Are you able to tell us whether or not changes were made?
No, I'm not.
Okay. All right. Can you tell us, though, that you read the draft and whatever changes you asked to be made, were you satisfied they were made in the final version?
I can't remember, to be honest. Having been given a draft to comment on, I'm sure I would have read it.
Yes.
And I would have provided some comments.
And you
I
were
was informed that the draft and the final were very, very similar.
Yeah, look, I'm sure they are. And if we can look at, probably for our purposes, going to the executive summary on page Roman 1 would be a good start. So it's the third page of the document, and we see there that the author, who's a gentleman that was employed by Richard Oliver International, Richard Oliver then and now risk assessment consultants, if that's a fair description.
I don't know about now, but
Okay,
they were
they
at
certainly
that point
were
in
then.
time.
All right. And the author notes that the project aim was to assess the fire risk of the worked out areas of the Morwell open cut, MOC, and that of course is what we now know as the Hazelwood mine. We're talking about the same thing.
Yes.
And to ascertain whether an exemption from the Latrobe Valley Open Cuts Fire Protection Policy 1984, specifically sections 1.1.4 and 1.1.5, would be appropriate and justifiable. And the conclusion that was ultimately reached by the assessor was that such an exemption would not be justifiable. Do you agree with that? And an exemption was therefore not sought. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. As it turned out, some amendments were made to the document when it was reissued in 1994 that changed the requirements for fire protection of the worked out batters.
That's correct.
Those amendments were more practical in terms of their application at the Hazelwood mine. Is that right?
Yep.
All right.
That's correct.
If we can go to the risk assessment, and just so that we understand the scope of what was being done, there's a definition of the worked out areas in 1.2.1, eastwards from the number 4 groin and including the northeastern and eastern batters. Perhaps if we could bring up a map of the mine, please. We can do the gridded map if that's available to us.
I attended panel hearing one other time and noted that the panel was struggling with definitions of the northern batters, and James Faithful this morning started to talk about that. I can give you a little bit of assistance in how the mine is broken up.
We're happy for any assistance you can give us, Mr. Palmy. So we've got a gridded map.
Grid doesn't help me much, but
Okay.
in terms of...
It helps us, though, in terms of understanding what you're saying to us.
All right. Graham James referred to it this morning as being, the mine is known for the fields as it was developed in.
Yes.
So the initial field was the east field, which comprises this area. The extent of the northern area is the definition between the water on that side. This is called number 4 groin.
So you're pointing, for the transcript, Mr. Palmy, you're pointing to the easternmost groin?
Yes.
Yes.
And we call that the definition of the east field.
Yes.
Within the east field we have the northern batters and the eastern batters. So that is the east field northern batters,
yes,
between this point and that point. And then the southwest field was developed after that. So there was a pivoting operation to go in here. And it basically, at that point, the mine looked like, well, it didn't go quite that far, until about here. So the mine looked like that. So that's the southwest field northern batters.
So the southwest field is
that
the area
4 groin
from where we now see the
across.
5 groins, is it? Is that right?
Number 4 groin, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9.
Okay, and obvious question, why is that the southwest field when it appears to be in the north part of the mine? It's relative to where you'd previously been.
Because they were heading in a westerly direction. And
yes.
This is called the southeast field. The next one along.
Of course it is. Yeah.
And then we thought we'd start again and we called that the west
field. Yeah. Well, that's certainly cleared things up for us.
I'm glad for that. So we have the northern batters broken into the southwest field northern batters and
yes,
the east field northern batters.
Yes.
And that's really the point of differentiation is number 4 groin.
Right. So
Which is where you see that dark, that's the water.
Yes.
That's that eastern wall boundary is number 4 groin. There were 3 other groins, but they're under the internal overburden dump.
So for the purpose of the transcript, the number 4 groin seems to overlap with 07. if I'm looking correctly at that. 07, and then west of that, we've got the Northern Batters South-West Field, is that right?
It's South-West Field, Northern Batters.
Northern Batters, which extends to grid reference J6 or I6, yes. And east of that point, or running in a southeasterly direction, we've got the Northern Batters South-East Field, is that right?
No.
I'm not helping. You tell us, Mr. Colby.
On that map, there are references made to descriptions. You say that they're not appropriate. For example, if you look closely, I think you'll find that there's references to northwest batters, northern batters, and northeast batters. But you don't understand it by that at all.
That's not how we...
Okay. Without spending too much time debating the nomenclature, we've got you have identified to us two parts of the Northern Batters.
Yes.
All right. If we go back to the description in the risk assessment of the Northern Batters extending eastwards from number 4 groin, that's the Northern Batters that extends south, pretty well south of the township of Morwell, or south-west of the township of Morwell.
This area through here?
Yes.
Eastfield, Northern Batters, and it, yes, the township of Morwell is approximately north of that.
Yes, thank you. And that was the area that was the subject of the assessment. And then we see at 1.3, this seems to summarise the position that had been put by the SEC, which was, with finite resources to be allocated to fire protection of the whole open cut, MOC considers it best to direct these resources to protection of personnel and assets in operating areas of the cut on the basis that these represent a greater fire risk than the worked out areas of the mine. So that was the proposition that was being put and was the subject of assessment. Is that right?
It is actually the basis of the Latrobe Valley Open Cut Fire Protection Policy.
Yes. But in the context of this assessment, that was the proposition that was put up and as essentially was being tested. Have I got that right?
I can't be certain of that.
Okay. Then the next paragraph reads, the fire risk of worked out areas may perhaps be better mitigated by restricting access to worked out areas and removing power poles from here, maintaining several charged water lines and by upgrading fire protection points for the cut as a whole, for example, more tanker filling points. That looks, once again, like the proposal that is being put up by the SEC that's being asked, that the risk assessors are being asked to test, essentially. Do you agree with that reading of it? Or
No.
You don't?
They were clearly asked to look at whether an exemption was appropriate.
Yes.
So on that basis, we weren't proposing that to be necessarily more tanker filling points.
Okay.
An exemption is an exemption. It doesn't require any action.
Except that it's apparent, isn't it, from reading this document, that what was being proposed by the SEC was that if an exemption was granted, there would be alternative means of fire protection, such as more tanker filling points. Isn't that what was being proposed?
I don't recall it being proposed like that. My recollection is that it was an exemption that was being sought.
Yes, all right. Anyway, the document, I guess, speaks for itself. We turn to the next page. There's a summary of the conclusions reached by the assessors, and the first thing they say is the risk of fire in the worked out areas is not minimal.
Yes.
Because, and then there are 3 dot points, there are about 20 fires a year in these areas, and if I could stop there, that's consistent with the evidence you gave earlier about what was happening at the time, that there were a significant number of fires which you associated with the welding activity.
Yes.
Second dot point, on average, their severity is similar to those fires in working areas of the mine in terms of usual extinction effort. And it's apparent if one reads the entire document that an assessment was made of how long it was taking to put out such fires and what sort of resources were being allocated.
Fire reports used to require an assessment at the time of the effort that was put into extinguishment. It's always, if you have people there and they create the fire, then they tend to get the fire out very quickly.
Yes.
So that's helpful.
And then the third dot point is the location of those fires near key vulnerabilities in terms of infrastructure and so on was identified as being part of the reason why such fires were obviously not desirable. Is that right?
Well, I was saying it wasn't minimal.
That's part of the rationale for why it's not minimal, yes. Then there's a discussion of legal liability, and then there's a discussion of the issue that was being asked to be assessed, that is policy exemption. And the authors say exemption from sections 1.1.4 and 1.1.5 would increase fire risk in the worked out areas and would increase SECV and MOC liability in this regard. Presently, this risk is not minimal, and exemption is thus not appropriate. They went on and said, moreover, any such policy exemption or modification should not proceed until there has been a demonstrable reduction in fire risk. And if we go on and look under the next heading, improvement to fire protection, am I correct in understanding that what was being conveyed by the author of the document is that it's not appropriate to consider an exemption now, but if alternative or additional means of fire protection were in place and could be shown over a period of time to reduce fire risk, it may be appropriate to reconsider the issue. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. So they go on and talk about what needs to be done. And if we go to the next page, a number of recommendations were made, which I want to ask you about. The first of them under the heading Fire Protection Systems was we would suggest the following recommendations based on this study. Undertake a detailed engineering survey of the fire water system and include assessment of the northeast corner coal production area in this. This survey should cover maintenance, design and pump performance aspects of the fire water system. Are you able to tell the inquiry whether any such detailed engineering survey was done based on this recommendation?
I can't be certain as to whether it was done at that point. It will have been done at some point between then and now, but I can't be certain as to whether it was done in direct response to that.
All right. Can we break it down? This was provided to you personally in 1992,
Yep.
and at least until 1994 you had responsibility for fire protection at the mine.
Yep.
If it was done in that 2-year period, would you have known that it was being done? Presumably you would.
More than likely I would, but not necessarily.
Okay.
My role was the operation of the system,
Yes.
not the design.
But you would expect, wouldn't you, to have been consulted if any such study was being done?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, as you sit there now, you don't know if such a study was done. You'd have
I'm not certain.
You're not certain
No.
it may have been done. It would be of assistance to the inquiry if any such study was done, so I do call for that, and if that's a document that exists, then we would ask that it be provided to the inquiry. There are further recommendations there which I don't need to ask you about, but I do want to ask you about a couple of aspects of the substance of the report. Do you agree that the executive summary is an accurate summary of the overall content of the remainder of the report?
In my reading of it, yes.
Yeah. Just go to a couple of aspects of it. If you go to page 2 of the actual report, so we can just scroll down 2 pages, please. There's a heading methodology there. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. The authors of the report set out their methodology under the heading definition of risk and risk analysis. And I want to ask you about a couple of those. In a format that I think anyone who has anything to do with risk analysis these days would be very familiar with, they considered the likelihood of occurrence, the exposure of the SEC and the likely consequences. That's broadly what they thought about. And we see that under the heading the consequences, which I want to ask you about, they noted that amongst the consequences of a fire in the worked out areas, 5th dot point, corporate image, and 6th dot point, very importantly for this inquiry, other community impact outside the mine. So there's clearly a recognition in 1992, if not earlier, that fire in this area of the worked out area could potentially impact on the community of Morwell. That's what they're talking about there, is it not, Mr. Palmer? Do you agree with that?
It could be read that way.
Yeah. And if I could just take you to a map which is included in the report. Pages are not numbered, but if it's page 4, if we can just scroll down. Yes, just... That's it. The legend tells us... If we could just shrink that a tiny bit more... That's it. The legend there tells us that this was a map produced which shows the fire incidents between November 1989 and April 1992, and the locations of the fires and their size are indicated by the little graphics with fire in them. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
We see a concentration of fires in the area adjacent to the Energy Bricks location in what is the northeast part of the mine, as we're looking at that.
This would be the Eastfield Eastern Batters?
Yes.
In this area?
And then I see at a point to west of that along the Northern Batters, there's a reference to the Northern Batters fire spotting tower. Do you see that? See where that is?
Yeah.
It's just to the right of the number 6.
Yes.
What was the Northern Batters fire spotting tower?
Open cuts are a little bit different to most other businesses in that...
That's one thing I think we've understood, Mr. Palmy.
Well, and one of the primary differences is that you can't mine yesterday's material today, so you have to keep moving. As a result of that,
Yes.
your proximity to infrastructure and observation points for the mining and things are changing.
Yes.
So quite a lot. So things like fixed infrastructure and things like that don't always reconcile with the fact that you're moving.
I understand all that, and I think I understand the point you're making. My question's a simpler one. What was the Northern Batters fire spotters tower? We know it's no longer in use as a fire spotters tower, but what was its purpose?
It was a small building, a 3
Yes.
metre by 3 metre building,
Yes.
that on days of high alert, people were stationed in there with a radio,
Yes.
so that they could radio back if they observed any outbreak of fire.
Yeah. And they were members of the dedicated fire service
Yep.
back in the day. And that building is no longer in use for that purpose.
Oh.
Is that right? And do you know when it ceased to be used as a fire spotting
No, I have
location?
no idea.
All right.
Can I just inquire whether on this other map, the grid map, there's reference to a southwest lookout. Is that something comparable in today's terms?
Perhaps if, Mr. Chairman, if you could identify the grid reference.
Oh,
of
the southwest lookout is just under the word Southern Batteries, which is on the west field.
Now, Southwest Lookout is a point where you can look over the operation,
So there's not a building, but it's just a
There's
place
no
where
building,
you
it's a point.
stand and look out.
observe.
It's like the Knuckle. It's known as a particular spot, but it has no building there too.
There's no building. It is a defined area with a timber fence, so that visitors can be taken there to look over the operation.
That's where every visitor gets taken, isn't it, Mr. Palmier, to get a view of
I don't know about every visitor.
All right.
A lot of
Very
visitors
cautious
do.
man, I can see, but it offers a very good vantage point.
Yes.
It was Mr. Shanahan, I think, who told us that was a point at which he had a meeting at one stage on February the 9th,
I did hear
because it
him say that.
enabled them to look at the entire mine and see where the fire was. Just before leaving the other map, that one, I see there's a reference towards the bottom of the picture, just above in the vicinity of the coal production office. There's the Eastern Batters Fire Spotters Tower. If you could just point that out to us.
This is the one?
Yes, and that served presumably the same purpose as the Northern Batters, albeit from a different vantage point.
Yes.
And once again, that's no longer
So the
in use, is that right?
So the concern there is that if fire is dug up and comes up on the conveying network,
Yes.
they would be able to observe it because this was the mine outlet at that point.
Yep, thank you. Just one more matter I need to ask you about in the risk assessment. This is at 3.6 on page 9 of the document. Not surprisingly, one of the issues that was considered here was the potential legal liability that might attach to the SEC and its officers in the event that changes were made to the fire protection systems that were under consideration. And the author of the report, based, it seems, on a letter of legal advice obtained from a law firm, which is attached to the back of the risk assessment, noted that under Section 43 of the Country Fire Authority Act, the SEC was bound to prevent the occurrence of fires on and to minimise the danger of the spread of fires on or from any land vested in it or under its control or management. And the concern that's there expressed there is because of the strictness of that duty, any change to fire protection arrangements might potentially increase legal liability on the part of the SEC.
That's my understanding of what it says.
I might be stretching your knowledge, but it's correct to say, isn't it, that that section of the Country Fire Authority Act, which is still in those terms, only applies to public authorities and local councils.
It's definitely stretching my knowledge.
All right. Perhaps you take it from me that it does. So it doesn't apply to the post-privatisation mine. You don't know. All right. And there is then a repetition of the recommendations which I've already taken you to. So I want to ask you about the response to receipt of this risk assessment. It was saying the sought for exemption was not justified.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably no exemption was sought. Is that right?
Yes, there was no further action.
If we can go back then to the position with the pipes, we can return to your statement at paragraph 26. You note that in 1994, so some 2 years later, there was a change to the code of practice. The SEC's 1984 code was replaced by Generation Victoria's 1994 fire service policy. Is that right?
Yes.
Sorry, just before going to that, there was something I meant to ask you. The risk assessment that we looked at in 1992, to your knowledge, has there been a subsequent risk assessment done in relation to fire protection in the worked out areas of the mine?
My understanding is that it forms part of the major mining hazards assessments.
Right. So that's where we would need to look, is it, for any such risk assessment?
Yes.
This one is clearly and specifically directed to that particular risk.
Yes.
As the inquiry understands it, there hasn't been a further risk assessment that's specifically directed to that risk since that time. My question is, are we right about that, or are you able to point us to any such document?
My understanding is that according to the legislation, anything that represents a risk to more than one life is considered a major mining hazard.
Yes.
And as a result, needs to be risk assessed formally. And fire in the mine is considered to be a major mining hazard.
Yes.
So it will have been risk assessed on that basis. Now, that risk assessment is probably more broadly based than this particular risk assessment,
Yes.
which was very specific.
Yes.
And I believe those risk assessments on major mining hazards go back to about 2003.
Yes.
And were conducted with the assistance of Quest, who were a specialist in risk assessments.
And they're the documents to which the inquiry's attention, I think, has been drawn in the last 48 hours or so by the legal team representing the operator, if I understand what you're talking about.
So that was the first time that they were reviewed?
Yes.
They've been subsequently reviewed, as I understand it, in 2009 with the assistance of GHD.
Yes.
And subsequently reviewed in conjunction with WorkSafe in 2012. as I understand it.
All right. But if we're looking for a document with a similar title to this at some time post-1992, we're not going to find it. Is that what you're saying to me? We've got to look at the general risk assessments that have been done in relation to major mining hazards.
I'm not aware of anything else other than those generalised ones.
All right. Just in relation to that, were you in the hearing room yesterday when Mr Neast of WorkCover was giving evidence? He seemed to be saying that a mine fire in the worked out areas of the mine did not meet the test of a major mining hazard. He seemed to be telling us that was the assessment that had been made by GDF Sewers. Can you comment on that?
No.
Could I just ask a couple of questions going to the Oliver report, which was attachment 3. On page 6, just to understand this, in the period 89 to 92, there seemed to be 11 fires per year in the worked out batters. That's how I'm reading that. That's on the top of page 6, 3.3.2. So these fires were occurring commonly. And then on the next page, there's some trend information about fire incidents across the whole of the open cut, which, a quick look at that is at least over 200 fire incidents per year. Do you happen to know what the current incident rate is in the worked out batters, or?
I have no idea.
You have no idea. I mean, presume that information is available. It was obviously being tracked back in those days.
I'm the wrong person to ask, I'm afraid.
Well, I'd be interested to find out about what the total incident rate is, and particularly what the incident rate is in the worked out batters. And what actually is the meaning of a fire incident, just so I understand that?
It can be virtually an ember. Anything where there is any smoke. Coal is quite distinctive, as I'm sure all the residents of Morwell can attest to, in terms of its burning. And you can often smell it before you can see it.
So it is actually something that's called a light rather than
Yes.
a risk of a fire occurring.
It is something that's called a light.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Mr Palmier, in response to a question from Professor Catford, you said you weren't the right person to ask about the current incidence of fires in the worked out batters. Who is the right person to ask?
The person in charge of that area.
And can you give us a name?
I can give you a number, but probably Rob Dugan.
Okay. I don't think anyone wants to bring Mr Dugan back, so I would just make a call for any records that can be provided to the inquiry by GDF Sewers in response to Professor Catford's question about the current incidence of fires.
So we'll have to ask that that call be clarified. We have provided reports with respect to every fire in the mine under paragraph 1 of the summons. Is what is being sought now something different from that?
I don't want to be an intermediary. Perhaps Professor Catford, if you could explain what you're after.
I have not looked at that in detail. I mean, I would be interested in a trend analysis, looking at incidents over a period of time in the way that this table is presented. So I'm not sure if you provided that, then I'm sure that will be
No, we haven't provided a trend analysis. We've provided, as we were summoned to do, every report spanning the years that we were asked for. So those are reports and reviews with respect to each individual fire. I'll have to now make inquiries about whether there is also something else which was not sought but is now being sought, perhaps in the nature of an update of this chart.
Yes,
I doubt it exists. I'm willing to ask, of course, and I will. If it doesn't exist, are we being asked to create it? A trend analysis, that is.
Well, perhaps it's something we could confer and decide what
And I'll
further
discuss
advice.
that with council system.
But obviously, within the data set you've been provided, it would be very interesting to know how many fire incidents there have been in the worked out batters. Have you provided that?
Well, we've provided every report with respect to every fire in the worked out batters and the operational parts of the mine, as we were requested to do.
Thank you.
Perhaps just to assist Professor Catford in the conversation, risk assessments would take into account incidents of fires, would they not?
I think this is dragging me into giving evidence, and I ought not do that, but I think they would, by sheer dint of the nature of those documents as usually constructed.
Can I deal with the matter this way, Professor Catford? I will liaise with Council for GDF Sewers in relation to the material that's been provided. I'm fully aware of the material that's been provided in response to paragraph 1 of the summons. It deals expressly with major incidents for which reports were prepared. We have that documentation. Whether it deals with this sort of data, the equivalent of the data that's set out in the risk assessment report, I'll seek to clarify that with Ms Doyle, and we'll see if we can further it that way. Just while we back on the risk assessment, there was one other matter I should have asked you about on the previous page. If we could just go back to page 6 of this document. It's page, just the previous page. So this, if we can just stop there, 3.3.2 examines the fire history, and after setting out the numbers, if we go down to Roman 4, it's noted there that piped water was the major means of fire suppression. That's a reference to the reticulated water system in the vicinity of the Northern Batters, is it not?
Yes.
Yep.
That's true.
Now, if we go back to your statement, please, and we pick up the story when the 1994 code came out, you attach that code and you note that the content and probably fair to say, the emphasis of what was required in the 1994 code was a change from what had been there in 1984. Is that fair to say? And you're referring specifically, this is attachment 4 to your statement, Annexure 4, page 10, section 4.4. This is where we first see a reference to tanker filling points being located in particular places as an alternative means of fire protection in the worked out areas of the mine. Are you able to assist the inquiry with understanding the reasoning for the change from the 1984 document to 1994?
Well, to some extent, but not to the full extent. Clearly, the response that came back from the review done by Richard Oliver,
Yes.
left a considerable degree of uncertainty as to how best to proceed. You need to bear in mind that the SEC had, less than 10 years prior to that, said that they wanted to have 20 Loyangs built in the next 50 years. And we're planning on undertaking substantial wholesale mining at the Latrobe Valley, which would leave lots of areas of exposed coal, potentially at least. And so I guess they were somewhat mindful of, if you're going to commit to having pipework on everything all of the time, that is going to be an enormous financial impost.
Yes.
That would be the background to it, I suspect.
Yes.
In terms of what actually transpired between the Richard Oliver document and the document as signed off by all of the mine managers in 1994, I'm afraid that was above my pay grade.
All right. In any event, what we see in the 1994 document in section 4.4 is third dot point. So 1 and 2 are the same, benches and berms. Then we go third dot point, tanker filling points are to be provided such that a tanker on any part of the worked out batters is within 5 minutes travel of a tanker filling point. Fixed sprays should be used in conjunction with the droppers for the tanker filling points in order to provide wetted brakes. And then we see that as an alternative, the fire brakes. So the thing's been turned around, rather than the fire brakes being the primary means of protection with an alternative provided in terms of water, you've now got tanker filling points and their location as the primary means with alternative of fire brakes. And if we can go back to your statement then, it's in that context that paragraph 27 of your statement that you say, having regard to those changes, I'm reading from the third line of paragraph 27, the removal of leaking and degraded pipes from worked out batters which could not hold pressure and using those pipes for drainage continued. I want to ask you about that word continued. That would seem to suggest that even before the 1994 code came into operation, that the removal of those damaged and corroded pipes that you talked about had already commenced. Am I understanding your evidence correctly?
Well, certainly in terms of the isolations,
yes.
There wasn't any choices.
Yes.
And I was trying to think back to how the SEC managed with drainage pipes at that stage, and I'm pretty sure it was all ex-fire service pipe that was used for drainage. And
you then go on and refer to a process of the removal of the pipes, and I want to get some understanding from you by reference, perhaps to the gridded map of the area that you're talking about where the pipes were removed from. The description you're giving here. Are you able to?
The area that I'm referring to
yes.
is principally the Eastfield Northern Batters area.
Can you perhaps with the ruler just remind us of that area?
Eastfield Northern Batters?
Yes.
From here through to number 4 groin?
Yes.
That area through there.
So that area there. So there's that was the first area that we saw in the first map we looked at, is that right? So the oldest pipe work.
Yeah. Well, the other area that was old was
yes.
this area in here, obviously.
Yes.
But the difference with this area here is that when the mine was operating in this area, right back to digging out of the southeast field, this was the mine outlet, and Energy Bricks, originally in here, this was the outlet for the mine, so everything that came out of the mine came out through this eastern outlet. Then they created, with the decision to build Hazelwood, they created the southern outlet, this area here. So all the coal came out the southern outlet. In order to get supply of coal to Energy Bricks, they left conveyors inside the mine on coal benches that actually supplied coal across here. So it came from that outlet inside. If you read the policy, this was conveyors inside on coal, situated on coal. So that required that there's a standard of protection required through here. So the pipes in here had to be retained as serviceable.
Yes.
So if that meant they had to be replaced, they had to be replaced in order to meet the policy. So the issues that I'm talking about are principally aligned to the Eastfield Northern Batters.
The obvious question, Mr. Palmer, is when the pipes were removed, and we understand the reason for their removal because of their rusted and corroded state, why weren't they replaced?
They didn't need to be in accordance with the policy.
So your evidence is that the reason the pipework wasn't replaced was because it wasn't required under the policy?
Mm-hmm. Operated consistent with the policy. But bear in mind, the policy's been built up after a lot of experience, and this particular event that we're here talking about, 9th of February 2014, is only the 4th time that fire has entered a mine in a pretty substantial period of time. The Yallourn mine's been in operation for 90 years, the Hazelwood mine for 60 years, and the Loyang mine for 30 years. A combined mine history of 180 years of exposure, and this is the 4th occasion on which this has happened. So that's an average recurrence of about once every 45 years. The last time it occurred was 1984, when this policy was revised. So the SEC had experience with 3 occasions where fire had come into the pit. They set up the policy to deal with that based on their experiences, and it has not occurred since until 2014. So this is not something that happens all that frequently. And I would suggest that it would be appropriate to go back through, look at the Latrobe Valley Open Cut fire protection policy in light of this event and determine the shortcomings.
That said, Mr. Palmer, even accepting your statistical analysis, if you go to the 1994 Code of Practice that was being implemented this time. This is attachment 4. And page 7 of the document. Under the heading Detailed Procedures and Practices, the very first thing that the authors say is Generation Victoria's brown coal open cuts have suffered a number of fires over the years. Many of these have emanated from external bushfires, and then there's a reference to the 1944 Royal Commission report. That's a clear recognition of the risk, is it not?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And is the reason you gave that evidence a moment ago about the infrequency of these events, is that meant to inform the inquiry that the decision not to replace the pipework was a justified decision, a justified gamble?
No, the point I was trying to make was that prior to this incident, 2009, all prior incidents of this nature had been under the ownership of the SECV, and they had built a policy that they believed was consistent and suitable for dealing with that threat.
Nonetheless, one of the things we know the emergency services had to do in order to put the fire out this year was reinstate the pipework in some areas, isn't it?
Can I suggest, and I believe the panel's heard from quite a number of people, that the important thing in fighting a fire is to get to it very early. And that in this particular case, the fire was pretty much able to burn without firefighting efforts for close to 27 hours. First 3 hours of that were resources, and this is my view of life, that's not necessarily everybody's view. First 3 hours, though, most of the resources were dedicated to an external threat, the Driffield fire approaching.
Mr. Palmer, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We know what happened. We've heard a lot of evidence about what happened on the 9th of February. My question is quite a different one. The pipework had to be reinstated as part of the firefight, did it not?
It did.
Yes.
Because the fire had been allowed to get to that point.
Yes.
Because there was no power.
Could we bring up the map at Exhibit 81, please? And I'll just ask you to have a look at this. This is a map that's been provided to the inquiry, Mr. Polmere, depicting those new areas of pipework that were installed during the firefight in February and March of this year. Do you see the blue lines of the new pipework? So some of it is in the centre of the mine on the floor, and then there is considerable pipework that's been installed on the northern batters, as you can see. And if I understand the evidence you've given, that corresponds in part with the area where the pipework was removed that we've just been discussing, does it not?
Some of that does, yes.
Yeah. That's on that map. If I could ask you to, with the ruler, just point out the area where the pipework was removed. I think it was the area of the northern batters where there's the blue pipework, and then an area to the east of that. Is that right?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Your moment ago identified for us the area of the northern batters where the pipework that had rusted was removed.
Yep, in this general area?
Yes. Okay. And have you got any idea of the length of pipework that was removed during that period?
I'm sorry.
No. Because we see from this map the length of new fire service pipe that was installed is just under 10 kilometres of pipe work, and there was also in excess of 15 kilometres of new drainage pipe installed.
15 kilometres of new drainage pipe.
That's what it says. Does that not accord with what you recall?
I don't know. I'm just surprised.
Okay.
Mr. Rosen, will you go back to, or perhaps I could just ask Mr. Palmier a question. I think your answer to Mr. Rosen's question, Mr. Palmier, was that you didn't replace the pipes because the policy didn't need to because of the policy was your answer. So we're talking about you didn't need to because the 1994 policy said you didn't have to.
That's correct.
Could you just guide me to where, in the part of the policy where that...
Well, it allows for the area to be protected using tanker filling points.
Okay.
Perhaps we just go back to that. That's attachment 4.4. Have I got the right part of it, Mr. Palmier?
Yes, the third dot point.
Third dot point, tanker filling points to be provided such that a tanker or any part of the worked out batters is within 5 minutes travel of a tanker filling point. I don't know, I think it was explored with one witness, but are you able to tell the inquiry whether that was done in that area?
Whether which was done?
Whether there was compliance with that requirement?
I believe so.
Well, when you say you believe so, was any testing done to ensure that the tanker filling points were within 5 minutes of travel? Do you know?
I don't know.
No.
But it's not part of my duties to know that.
Okay. But you would assume, would you, that some assessment would have been done so that there was compliance with at least that?
Yep, I would have thought so.
If I understand your evidence correctly, what was being done was considered to be in strict compliance with the minimum requirements of the code. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you remember I asked you earlier whether those prefacing words as a minimum requirement appeared in later versions.
Yep.
You'd agree with me that they do appear under
They do.
4.4.
Yep.
And it was to that minimum requirement that the SECV was setting its sights. Do we understand you correctly?
That's my understanding.
And then subsequent to that, post-privatisation, there continued to be an approach of
Compliance with the policy.
compliance with the minimum requirements of the policy.
Yes.
Yeah. And just in conclusion, from your statement, Mr. Palmier, you do say that in addition to pipework that had been removed because of its corroded status, there was also some pipework removed to facilitate the rehabilitation of a particular area of the mine. Is that right?
Yes, I actually said that there's, on the very last statement.
Yes. Paragraph 29.
Yeah, sorry, can we have the aerial photograph up again?
Certainly. Aerial photograph of the mine.
In 1998, up until 1998, so from 1955 until 1998, all of the overburden from the mine was dumped externally.
Yes.
The external overburden dump.
Your
In 1998, overburden was placed in the worked out Eastfield
Yes.
area up to Groin 4 in two layers. An initial layer over the entire area and then a subsequent layer. There were pipelines through these areas that had to be removed or at least isolated.
Yes.
You can't have a charged fire service main within an overburden dump because if it does happen to leak, then it will build up the water pressures in it, potentially liquefy and slide down the hill.
Yes.
So there would have been lines removed as a result of that development, and subsequently the building of the Hazelwood ash retention embankment would have caused further pipework to have been removed in these areas. So, as I said, mines are living things, so the one space changes in time, and that's why you get conflict with fixed infrastructure, like pipelines. It's my experience that and the pipelines that are installed are quite expensive to install. Where you make that investment, it's very unlikely that you'll then make a further investment to come along and unnecessarily pay money to remove things if they're providing a function that you need. That's my experience.
And in conclusion, Mr. Palmier, you say at paragraph 30 then other than for reasons that the pipework had become unserviceable and to enable the area that you've identified to be rehabilitated, you know of no other reason for pipework being removed. Am I understanding correctly what you say?
Yes.
They're the questions that I have for Mr. Palmier. Members of the board?
I think at the end of one of your answers you mentioned the fact that the loss of power at a critical time meant that what had in the past happened had not happened on this occasion, and that was a factor that impinged upon your assessment of the situation. Now, did I understand that correctly?
Well, it's my belief that the fire was able to escalate to a substantial degree.
Substantially in that period
And then, in order to try and be able to put it out, required
the capacity of the tanker filling points had been, which had been able to be relied upon in the past, had been exceeded, so that was no longer an option. Just one thing so far as the power, under this reference in one of the documents to the recommendation that the power poles be concrete, not wood. Has that been the case?
I'm not sure the document referring to. If you're referring to the policy...
I think it was the Richard Oliver one included...
My understanding is that was referring to the distribution system within the mine. So they're the poles that supply power within the mine at 6,600 volts. The lines that went down on the day were the 66,000 volt lines. 66,000 volt lines that supply to the substations that then supply the distribution system in the mine.
And what were they made of?
Timber, which is why they went down.
Could I ask a question about early detection of fires? We talked briefly about the spotting towers or tower that might have existed in the past. Are there new technologies that are useful here to detect a fire just as it's beginning to smoulder? I'm thinking, for instance, of
the human nose is very good.
Yeah, but it's a huge, it's a huge mine. This isn't it?
It is.
I'm thinking. Is there infrared technologies? If someone's lost in a mountain, the planes can pick them up from their emissions of heat.
I suspect that you'd be better to ask somebody with a bit better background than myself on that question.
Mr. Lapsley might possibly be able to advance that.
Yeah, but I would have thought GSOs would be aware of technology. I agree that you may not be the right person. It would be interesting to find out if there are, what is best practice in terms of early detection of fires.
I know technology was used extensively in the firefight. I was the liaison officer with the CFI, so I'm aware of the technologies that they were using for identification of areas of concern, but I'm not sure that they're necessarily sustainable for the situation you're talking about, because they were pretty much airborne devices, either on helicopters or planes that were in use. That was really to determine the areas of greatest need in the firefight, but for detection when it's very, very small, I'm sorry, I can't assist you.
Presumably it's a huge task if you're relying on the human nose or the human eye in such a large expanse.
And if I could just add to that, that's particularly the case, is it not, where you no longer have dedicated fire spotters on high fire dangers days?
Well, I would have to disagree with you there. The way that we're organised
yes,
actually requires people to be pulled out of their work to actually do those sorts of tasks on those sorts of days. And on that day, I'm the wrong person to ask, but I don't think your statement's correct.
All right. No doubt I'll be corrected. They're the questions I have for Mr. Palmer. I understand Ms. Doyle has at least a question.
No, I have good news. The learned members of the tribunal stole my re-examination questions, so I have no further questions for Mr. Palmer.
That's good news for everyone except me, because it means I don't get a break. Could Mr. Palmer please be excused?
Okay.
The next witness is Professor David Cliff. I call Professor Cliff.
My name is David Ian Cliff.
Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
to this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Professor Cliff. You've been waiting patiently to give your evidence here today. Firstly, could you state for the transcript your full name and professional address, please?
My name is David Ian Cliff.
And you hold the position there as, in your capacity as a professor, you head up the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Centre, is that right?
I do. I'm the Professor of Occupational Health and Safety in Mining.
Okay. And the centre is located in the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland, is that correct? For the purposes of this inquiry, having been retained by the solicitors to the inquiry to provide us with an expert report, have you in fact prepared a report dated June 2014?
I have.
And have you attached to that report a curriculum vitae?
I have.
And I see, like a previous witness that we've heard from, the CV exceeds in length the report itself.
Yes.
That seems to be the case. And perhaps I can just ask you a little bit about your background, or perhaps before I do that, have you read through a copy of the report that you've prepared for us before giving me evidence today?
I have.
Is it the case, Professor Cliff, that this morning you made a number of minor changes to the copy of the report that had been distributed to the parties last week?
I corrected a few typos, yes.
Yeah, they are purely typographical errors. And for assistance of the parties, particularly my learned friend Ms Doyle, I've pointed out that the version of the report that had been distributed is, for present purposes, in substance no different to the final version with those typos fixed. So if we could, perhaps I'll just ask you, are the contents, with those changes being made, are the contents of the report true and correct?
They are.
And insofar as you express opinions in the report, are they opinions that are honestly held by you?
They are.
I'll tender the report.
Yes, on Exhibit 91.
Now, Professor Cliff, a little bit about your background. If we can bring up your CV, which we will find at starting at page 17 of the report. I don't think we need your phone details. If we go to the next page, please, page 18. As you've already told us, you hold the current position, and you have since March 2011, of the Professor of Occupational Health and Safety in the Minerals Industry and Director of the centre within the institute that you've talked about. You then list a number of projects. They're projects that have been engaged in by the institute or by you personally, or both?
They are through the university. I've been engaged to provide advice to people.
Right. I want to ask you about a couple of those. The second dot point there, you were retained as an expert advisor to the New Zealand Police regarding recovery and re-entry to the Pike River coal mine. That was, of course, in the South Island of New Zealand. When was the Pike River coal mine disaster?
November 19, 2010.
Okay. And what was the role you played in relation to advising the police?
I acted as an expert advisor to them in analysis and interpretation of the state of the mine after the first explosion, and in their efforts to manage the recovery and re-entry of the mine to attempt to recover the miners that were trapped in the mine.
That, of course, was an underground coal mine.
Yes, it was.
And it was black coal that they were mining there, is that right?
It was a thick seam black coal, yes.
And then the next dot point, you then went on to be an expert advisor to the Department of Labor regarding cause of explosions at the Pike River coal mine. What was the nature of that advice that you were providing to the Department of Labour, and what was the Department of Labour's role in relation to the mine?
Well, the Department of Labour had the jurisdiction over the mining industry in terms of health and safety.
Yes.
I was retained as part of an expert panel to investigate the causes of the explosion and whether or not there would be charges laid against the people involved.
Right, against the operator of the
The
mine?
operator of the mine, yes.
All right. Did you play a role in the Royal Commission that was held in relation to the Pike River coal disaster?
I attended an expert report to the Royal Commission. It wasn't called for evidence.
Okay.
It wasn't disputed.
I'll return to your experience with the Department of Labour in New Zealand because, like Victoria, they are a workplace health and general workplace health and safety inspectorate that happen to have responsibility in relation to mines as well. Is that
That's
the position?
correct, yes.
So similar to the position in Victoria.
Very similar in terms of size and
Yes.
the nature of the legislation, yes.
All right, we'll come back to that in a moment. Towards the bottom of that list of projects, you note that you're a course lecturer in relation to occupational health and safety management systems for mining, and also you had some guest lecturing roles as well. Is that right?
I do a bit of lecturing, yes.
Yeah. When you're not giving expert evidence.
Yeah.
Prior to your current position, you held the position of Associate Professor in the Minerals Institute Safety and Health Centre. That's the same?
Same place.
Same place?
Yep.
One level down in the pecking order, and that was a position you held for 10 years, and you list the activities that you're engaged in there. I should have asked you, if we go back to the previous page under the heading Education, your undergraduate education was obtained at Monash University here in Victoria, and you obtained a Bachelor of Science with honours and first-class honours in chemistry. And postgraduate, you completed a PhD at Cambridge University in England.
That's correct.
And your thesis title, The Laser Magnetic Resonance Spectroscopy of Free Radicals. I won't even begin to ask you what that means, but it's in the field of physical chemistry, I take it.
Yep.
And you list other qualifications that you have there. If we can go back to the report itself on page 5, you draw the inquiry's attention to some particular research areas that you state to be relevant to the opinions that you express. The first is you draw the inquiry's attention to your research into the processes affecting coal combustion, in particular your role as the co-author of the textbook Spontaneous Combustion in Australian Underground Coal Mines. And you go on and explain that that's the source of much of the information that you've used in your report. And in particular the views you express about the nature of brown coal combustion and so on, which I'll take you to in a moment. You then refer to consultation to mines experiencing mine fires or explosions. Can you just give us a summary of the sort of consultative work you've done for mines and for mine operators relevant to this inquiry?
I've provided advice to about 35 incidents at mines of varying levels of severity, in terms of it could be to assist them in recovering the mine, re-entering the mine. It could be insurance claims when they've lost equipment due to a fire underground or on the surface. It would be providing advice to governments in terms of developing processes for managing incidents. It would be providing education and advice to inspectors both here and overseas in particular areas in terms of fires and explosions in coal mines and metal mines.
In terms of your roles with inspectorates, mining inspectorates, what do you provide training to mining inspectors?
I have provided training to mine inspectors on risk management, health and safety management systems, principal hazard management, as we call it in Queensland, or major hazard management, and more defined areas such as mine re-entry after an emergency and sealing of underground mines in an emergency.
The third dot point in that list, you draw attention to your familiarity with the development and implementation of occupational health and safety management systems, principal hazard management plans and the risk assessment process. you've probably partly answered the next question. That familiarity has been gained in the course of the consultancy work you've done in relation to mines. Is that right?
In part, we also
Yes.
offer postgraduate education through our university in mining.
Yes.
And in particular, we have subjects that deal with occupational health and safety management systems in mining, risk management in mining, both qualitative and quantitative, and hazard management plans, as well as occupational hygiene and other related areas.
All right. Finally, you draw attention to research and experience in the management of emergencies in the mining industry. You've referred already to the Pike River disaster in New Zealand. Are there other particular emergencies in the mining industry that you would draw our attention to, that you've had exposure to, that are relevant to what we're looking at?
Well, in terms of real emergencies, I've dealt with Mara number 2, 1994, evacuation of a number of mines in Australia, 8 in the last 15 years. I've also undertaken research to improve the management of emergencies through the application of the AIMS system, which we call MEMS in Queensland. That's the Australian Incident Management System, which is used by most emergency services to manage emergencies. We've participated in the research groups and the working parties to tailor that for application in the mining industry in Queensland and in New South Wales.
Right. And just whilst you're on that topic, is there a specific version of AIMS? That's AIIMS, I think. Am I right there?
I think it might be. One or two.
Is there a tailored version of that used in relation to mining incidents in Queensland?
There is a tailored version called MEMS used in Queensland, the Mine Emergency Management System. There's also just been released in New South Wales a very similar AIMS-based system available through the Coal Services Mines Rescue Service Unit.
I've been asked to slow down, Professor Cliff, and I think that might possibly also apply to you. So we can both consider ourselves to be ticked off. I'll lead the way. In relation to open-cut brown coal mines, prior to being engaged on this task, have you had much exposure to open-cut brown coal mines in your working life?
My first research work in Australia was with the CSIRO in Sydney, where I spent 3 years burning brown coal in various stages in the laboratory, trying to modify its combustion processes to minimise pollution effects. So I spent 3 years studying brown coal combustion.
Right. What about the operation of open-cut brown coal mines as such?
I've had very limited exposure to Victorian brown coal mines.
Okay. Can I ask you a little bit about the task that you're engaged to perform for the inquiry? If we can go back to page 2 of your report, please. You received a letter and had a number of phone calls with staff at the inquiry, and ultimately your attention was drawn to the second and third of the terms of reference in the terms of reference that established the inquiry, and you were asked to assist the inquiry in relation to those. And I don't want to read those out, but do you agree that they essentially, the second term of reference requires the inquiry to examine the adequacy and effectiveness of measures taken by the operator of the mine, and the third term of reference is concerned with the adequacy and effectiveness of the role played by the relevant regulatory regimes in respect of the mine, both focused on the prevention of fire in the mine. So that was the task that you were asked to assist us with, and in the letter that you received there were 10 matters that were set out that you were asked to address, and you've listed them on pages 2 and 3 of your report. If we just go down to the bottom of the page, I've noticed that I think the word draft in that first line should be deleted, should it not, from this final report?
Yes, I'm sorry, apologise.
I'll just delete that word there. The information that you were provided with, you received a large number of documents from the inquiry solicitor.
I received the documents listed in item 5, plus a few more by email, and then a large chunk last night.
Yes, it's been a dynamic process, has it not, the receipt of documents, and we are very grateful, Professor Cliff, for your forbearance in that regard, and that you have been prepared to read documents offered at very short notice. For the assistance of the parties in the inquiry, a list has been prepared of the documents that were provided to you, and it's divided into two sections, those that you reviewed and those that you were unable to review. I'd just ask you to have a look at this document, please, and copies are provided to the parties. I think I'm right, aren't I, Professor Cliff? There's a document that you've previously looked at today to assure yourself these are the documents that you were provided with and divided into the ones you reviewed, ones you didn't. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know if having received the ones at the bottom of the page, the last three.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I couldn't find any record of those three.
Okay.
But the ones that are listed as being reviewed by me, I'm happy with those, yes.
Yes. I would ask that that be added to the exhibit, please, to Exhibit 91.
Yes.
In addition to reviewing those documents, which include the transcript of yesterday's proceedings, and of course you've sat in on the hearing today, you also went on a tour of the mine.
Yes, I did.
And from memory, Professor Cliff, are you able to recall how long the mine tour took?
I would have thought it was a big hour, basically. Maybe an hour and a half.
Right. So after successfully completing the induction, you went on the tour and you were driven around the mine, were you not? And you were able to view the mine from the vantage point that was identified by the previous witness?
Yes, I was.
And then you also entered the mine as such and were able to view the northern batters and other areas?
Yeah, we saw the northern batters, certainly, yes.
Yes. In addition to the material provided to you and what you saw at the mine, you've also obviously conducted your own research in relation to relevant areas that have enabled you to prepare the report.
Yes, correct.
With all that in mind, can we go to the first substantive topic, which is on page 5 of your report under the heading Brown Coal Fires? You were asked to describe the characteristics of brown coal fires with particular reference to the type of coal mined at the Hazelwood open cut mine. You've partly answered the first question, which is what enables you to express these opinions. I think you've told us you spent, 3 years burning brown coal. The brown coal that we find in the Latrobe Valley, can you briefly describe to the inquiry any particular features of the brown coal here in the valley compared to elsewhere?
Brown coal is what we call a low rank coal,
yes,
which means it's geologically quite young. That means, in general, it is a very reactive coal by comparison to the black coals you would find in Queensland and New South Wales. It also has other properties, such as it is much higher in oxygen content. It is much more porous when dry. The inherent moisture content is huge by comparison. For example, I think typically it's about 60% as mined. In Queensland it would be 10, 11% if you're lucky. The seams are thicker. I think if I could find a 100 metre thick black coal seam in Queensland, we'd all be happy, including Clive Palmer. But we normally mine 3 to 6 metre seams of black coal. So brown coal is much younger geology, it's much more reactive, it's more porous, it's larger. It's therefore much more prone to spontaneous combustion, which is the self-heating of the coal. And if you catalyse it, because it is younger, once it dries out, it's almost like touch paper.
You note that brown coal is particularly reactive, and you list a number of factors which will determine the rate of the reaction of brown coal with oxygen in air. And I won't take you through all of those, but you summarise it in the final dot point, or rather the third dot point on page 6 of your report, where you note, in paragraph starting in essence, under the meteorological conditions that existed at the time of the fire, and I interpolate there, that's the 9th of February this year you're talking about, the abandoned batters that caught fire at Hazelwood mine exhibit a number of the conditions that make it likely for the coal to ignite easily and for the fire to spread. You identify thick seams of coal, some of which was fragmented with cracks and fissures, loose piles of coal, etc. high vertical faces of coal that would allow heat transfer under convection into more coal. Can you just expand on that second dot point?
Well, okay, they're 45 degrees rather than vertical, but heat rises. So if a fire is ignited at the base of a coal seam, it'll naturally work up the face of the coal seam because that's where the heat's going. That then induces a convective current. So air naturally moves up the face of the coal, which of course also fans the coal and makes the fire get worse and causes the fire to propagate.
Hot, dry wind, which evaporates the moisture and heats the coal, I think is self-explanatory. And then finally, the wind would provide a plentiful supply of oxygen and a vector for heat transfer along the batters. And the evidence from the Bureau of Meteorology is that through the course of certainly the afternoon on the 9th of February, the fire was fanned by very strong winds, predominantly from the west and the southwest. So that would have the effect that you've there described. Next question you were asked was to describe the most effective ways in which such fires can be suppressed, and you were asked to take into account the four factors that are listed there. You explain in some detail what is required to suppress a brown coal fire burning in the batters that you've referred to. And you note that you can either remove the fuel or remove the heat or isolate the air supply from the coal and stop the chemical oxidation reactions from occurring, or some combination of those. You then talk about the difficulties associated with removing the fuel. And then in the second last paragraph on page 6, you say removing the heat requires the application of huge quantities of water, as was undertaken to fight the fire. Adding surfactants to the water, such as are used in foams, increases the wetting capacity of the water and helps get the water into the pores of the coal. Can you just explain what you're referring to? We've heard some evidence of foam, and there's some photos which I think you've seen in evidence today of the application of foam to the batters, but what is it that you're referring to there that foam does?
Well, normally a foam, we call it surfactant. It's an agent that bonds to a surface. If you're applying water to a vertical or near vertical surface, it'll run away very quickly. It has very little adhesion properties. So you need something which will cause it to bind to a surface. Foams, surfactants are very good at doing that. They also form a thicker blanket to isolate air from the surface of the coal. So that's why we use foams to do those sorts of things, and you see the effect of either a high expansion foam, I think in that case, or maybe a low expansion foam to stick to that surface. And also stops the erosion effect of the water, probably too.
You then go on and describe other difficulties, and the inquiry's had a great deal of evidence of the difficulties faced by firefighters in putting the fire out, and the duration of the firefight itself speaks to those difficulties. And you conclude immediately above the heading Regulation of Mines on the following page, page 7. You say the emphasis with coal mine fires is on prevention rather than mitigation for all of the reasons outlined above. Probably speaks for itself, but do you want to expand on that?
Well, I'm sorry, the firefighting is always very difficult. The prevention by proper design is always, the hierarchy of control is always, where possible, the way to go, because as it was seen every time you have a fire in a mine that I've been involved in, it's always difficult, extremely expensive and hazardous to reach. In some ways, an open cut fire is the easiest fire because you actually see it and get some access to it. But once it takes hold, because coal has such a huge heat capacity, putting it out is very difficult.
I can turn then to the fourth matter that you were asked to provide advice about. You were asked to provide views on the adequacy of the Victorian regulatory framework for fire prevention and suppression compared to practices elsewhere in Australia and overseas. And you commence your discussion of that topic at the top of page 8, where... the previous page. Page 8?
That's this one.
Yeah. That's it. You say, like all regulatory frameworks in Eastern Australia, the emphasis is on the management of risk through safety management systems and major or principal hazard management plans. Are you referring there to regulatory frameworks, obviously enough, in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, am I right?
In Queensland and New South Wales, of course, there's specific mining legislation, mine safety legislation, and they, like the Victorian legislation, have an emphasis on occupational health and safety management systems and the reduction of risk as low as reasonably practicable or achievable.
Right. I'll just stop you there. We talked briefly about Queensland and New South Wales. As I understand your evidence, there is legislation in those jurisdictions that deals expressly with occupational health and safety in mines.
A separate act and legislation in Queensland.
Yes.
It applies only to mines. The
Yes.
General OHS Act does not apply to mines.
Yes.
In New South Wales, the OHS Act and regulations apply to mines, but there's an additional act for coal mines, health and safety and regulation, and an additional act for metalliferous mines and regulation that adds to the OHS Act.
As you're aware, in Victoria we have an Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that applies to all workplaces, including mines. We have regulations that apply to all workplaces, including mines, and then we have a dedicated part of those regulations that applies specifically to mines.
Yep, I understand. Yeah.
If I understand what you're saying in this part of your report, you're saying despite the different regulatory or legislative arrangements in Queensland and New South Wales compared to Victoria, in all three of the jurisdictions, the regulatory approach is based on the management of risk through safety management systems or similarly worded concepts.
Yes, I believe that, yes.
Okay. And you say that in each jurisdiction, the development and revision of those plans should be based upon a risk assessment process or what's called a safety assessment in the Victorian regulations.
That's probably not quite true. Upon reflection, looking at the Victorian regulation, the safety assessment is a subset of the overall risk assessment process and relates only to what is called a major mining hazard in Victoria.
Yes. Is that concept of a major mining hazard, which we heard a deal of evidence about yesterday and we understand to be a mining hazard that, I think I'm correct in saying, will probably result in more than one fatality? That's not an exact reference, but should do for our purposes. Is that found in the regulatory arrangements in Queensland or New South Wales?
No, it's not. There is no statement about safety assessment or multiple fatality. The legislation in those states refers to assessment of the risk on the basis of the consequence and the likelihood and the severity of the consequence, because it entails the severity. So it overtly talks about a range of risk, levels of risk and consequence.
Is that a difference of significance from your examination of the material in this case and what you heard about in the evidence yesterday? Does the existence of this concept of a major mining hazard have any significant effect on the way the mining industry is regulated in Victoria compared to what happens in our northern neighbours?
I would say that from the experience of obtaining information about the management of the safety at the mine and the documents that have been put together, the only safety assessments or risk assessments I've seen relate to major mining hazards, which relate to only one consequence, which is potential for multiple fatalities. When you look at the risk assessments done for principal mining hazards, we'll call them in Queensland, they allow for explicitly a range of consequences in their risk assessments, not just the potential for multiple fatality.
We see in the evidence, and I think you're aware of this, Professor Cliff, that as far as the regulatory approach of the regulator here, the Work Cover Authority, is concerned, its verification audits that it carries out on an annual basis are directed solely to major mining hazards. That's the focus of its regulatory attention. So perhaps it's not surprising, if you accept that that's the case, that the focus of the people that are being regulated, the mine operators, seems to be very much focused on those major mining hazards as well.
I'm not sure, because if I read the new Victorian regulation correctly, the OHS management system requires the management of mining hazards, and mine fire is a mining hazard, not a major mining hazard, and that it requires the risk to be managed. And my understanding from the induction of GDF SUIS is the GDF SUIS is accredited to Australian Standard 4801, which is Occupational Safety and Health Management System.
Yes.
And it also requires risk management to be undertaken through a risk assessment process. So I would expect that if the company is managing risk rather than complying with the legislation, and if I'm an academic for a minute here, we promote management of health and safety in Australia, not compliance, then management of health and safety will require risk management and risk assessment to be undertaken, in addition to the safety assessment.
So despite the safety assessments only attaching to major mining hazards, it's clear that in relation to mere mining hazards, if I can call them that, there is still a requirement in the legislation, both here and interstate, to engage in a risk management approach. Is that right?
That would be my understanding. If you follow the Australian Standard or MDG 1010, that's Mine Design Guideline 1010 from New South Wales.
So I'll just get you to slow down there.
Sorry. Mine Design Guideline 1010 from New South Wales.
What was the acronym? Mine Design...
MDG.
MDG.
Mine Design Guideline, which is risk management in mines.
Yes.
Issued by the New South Wales Department of, I think it's called Industry and Innovation nowadays, or it may have changed again. They require an overall risk assessment process prior to development of plans, major hazard management plans. So for mine fires, under its required legislation, they would undertake that process. And it's a staged process. You start out with a broad brush risk assessment, then you define into more detailed defined risks based upon scenarios and event mapping through a fault tree or an event tree system.
All right. I want to ask you about your references to reasonably practicable and reasonably achievable, the two phrases that you refer to. You note that in Victoria there is a requirement to reduce risk so far as is practicable, and we've heard a deal of evidence about that yesterday. And you then go on in this paragraph, 4 lines from the end of the paragraph, to say other jurisdictions do vary the wording. For example, the Queensland mining OHS legislation refers to reducing the risk to within acceptable limits as well as reasonably achievable. You say this places an overt emphasis on community standards of acceptability as well as achievability. Are you saying that the level of allowable, if I can use a neutral term, allowable risk in the Queensland legislation is lower than is allowed by reference to the reasonably practicable test in Victoria? Is there a difference between those two standards? And if so, what is it?
I'm not a lawyer, I freely admit to that, but there's a direct statement in the Queensland legislation that says that risk must be reduced to acceptable limits.
Yes.
Which implies that there's a standard acceptability which must be adhered to. There is no such statement directly in the Victorian legislation, although I believe maybe people would imply that comes under the reasonably achievable. But it doesn't say that as such. So it could be interpreted that there is no benchmark as such. It's a payoff all the time against what you can do against the level you can achieve.
The Victorian legislation, as I think you know, requires a consideration of likelihood of a hazard causing harm and the extent, the consequences of the harm, as well as the cost of implementing control measures, and seems to involve a type of balancing exercise looking at those things, so that if you've got a relatively minor risk but it's exceedingly expensive to address it, then it wouldn't be reasonably practicable to do so. And the example that's been given here by a witness from WorkCover was the question of rehabilitating the coal batters as a way, the worked out coal batters as a way of addressing fire risk, that because of the expense associated with it, it probably wouldn't be reasonably practicable under the test in Victoria to do it. Is cost a consideration under the Queensland legislation of what's acceptable and reasonably achievable?
There's no overt statement about cost in the Queensland or New South Wales legislation. The only consideration of cost comes in incremental change once you reach an acceptable level of risk, because the whole aim of the exercise is not to achieve a minimum standard, but to achieve the best practice standard, and the limits on reasonability then may include cost once you've got to an acceptable standard.
You go on in the next paragraph of your report to make reference to section 5.3.23 of the Victorian safety regulations, and we examined that in some detail yesterday. I think you would have seen that in the transcript of yesterday's hearing. You note the particular parts of that you consider to be important. I want to ask you about one of those. So you've got a series of 5 dot points, and then we go into 2 dot points, and then we go to a further series of indented dot points. It's the fifth of those, the one describe all measures considered for the control of risks associated with major mining hazards and describe the reasons for adopting or rejecting the control measures considered. Is that a concept that you're familiar with as part of risk assessment, that the outcome, the document that's produced as a result of the process identifies possible control measures and then discusses which are implemented and which are not and why?
That is the process I'm used to following, yes.
Yeah. And what's the advantage of that from a safety promotion point of view, and particularly in relation to what we're looking at, fire prevention?
There are a number of advantages. If you document the process for the decision making, you are able to review that process at a later date. It is able to be exposed to external scrutiny. So, for example, an inspector can assess the situation to see whether your decision making was relevant or valid. Should the circumstances change where there's something you're making a decision change, you're able to go back as a flag to the risk assessment process and modify the decision-making process and test for adequacy.
You go on to refer to the documentation provided by GDF Sewers, and you say it doesn't demonstrate compliance with conditions, and as a consequence it is not possible to evaluate the assessment process for adequacy. Just so that we understand what you're referring to there, could Exhibit 66, and particularly the document behind tab 10, this is the bow tie diagram that evidence was given about yesterday, which was in behind tab 26 of the GDF Sewers folders. Yes, that's it. Bit hard to see. Perhaps if we could...
I'll take your word for it.
We'll do better than that. We'll provide you with a hard copy that's colour. Still not the easiest thing to read, but easier than that, I think.
Good. I didn't bring my microscope. Okay. Yeah.
I'm
familiar with the content of
You've got an
diagram.
A4, yeah. This is what's been referred to as a bow tie diagram. Now, you have a bit to say about that in your report, about whether or not it meets that description. What is a bow tie diagram, Professor?
Well, this is not really what I would call a bow tie. A normal bow tie diagram has an unwanted event in the middle of the bow tie, the knot of the bow tie. On the left-hand side, you have the causes. On the right-hand side, you have all the consequences. And between the causes and the event, you have the preventive controls. Between the unwanted event and the consequences, you have the mitigating controls. Now, controls are actions or barriers that prevent or mitigate the event. So they're not things like a piece of paper or a plan. They are a firefighting system. They are automated controls. They are evacuation. They are self-contained self-rescuers. So they are things you can identify as being able to control something. So when I see a document like this, it summarises the systems and processes the mine has on site, maybe to manage these issues,
yes.
But it gives me no detail about how they're actually going to work, or in fact how they're going to mitigate any consequence, because there is no actual consequence listed on this diagram. But of course, being a major mining hazard, the only consequence being considered is multiple fatality. So one has to presume it's a consequence they're dealing with.
So can I ask you, by reference to this, perhaps hypothetically, can we construct at least in outline what a bow tie diagram addressing the risk of a fire in the worked out batters of the Hazelwood coal mine would look like? Would you have on the left-hand side a series of possible causes of such a fire? Is that right?
In my experience, in dealing with bow ties, when I do them,
yes.
or I'm involved in doing them, they would be very incident-specific. So you would look at, you would first of all go from an event tree or something, what we call an event tree, and a series of events to cause an incident. You'd look at the causes and the linked causes. So, for example, take the event of the 9th of February.
Yes.
If we assume that it was a bushfire as the ignition point, spreading to the mine, causing the fire in that banded area, that would be the chain on the left-hand side of the unwanted event, which is the fire on the batters.
Yes.
It would then split into the potential consequences. So you'd have things such as multiple fatalities, injury, damage to plant, loss of asset, loss of production, that harms the local community.
Yes.
They would all be the consequence on the right-hand side. Then you would put, well, okay, how can we prevent bushfire spreading to the mine?
Yes.
How can we prevent the mine from once the coal's ignited, it's spreading? And so between each of those things, you'd identify functions or barriers. So, for example, you would have things like the fire breaks, so the 50-metre fire break for a scrub fire is probably not much good. The capping, water fire tankers, all that sort of stuff would be various controls you put in that thing.
Yes.
So your bow tie would actually be quite specific to a scenario, generally, or a group of scenarios, rather than, for example, in this diagram, where bushfire and things all rolled into one.
So just for completeness, if you go to the second page, looking down the left-hand side of the document, hard to read on the screen, but the second mustard-coloured box on the left-hand side, second from the top, has got bushfire in the middle of it. Do you see that?
I'll take your word for it.
Okay, I think you'll have to. And above it in red, it says assessed risk level equals high, and then there's a series of boxes which, as I understand it, refer to a series of specific control mechanisms which are then attached to this document. You're aware of the attachments that I'm referring to?
Yes.
And then moving along the right-hand side, you get to a dark blue box, and it says inside that, I'll ask you to accept this, assessed risk level equals as low as reasonably, it says practical, but I assume it means practicable. Does that not conform to a proper risk assessment as you've experienced it in relation to the mining industry?
If it's a bow tie, we would not normally put risk ranking on a bow tie. If you're doing a risk assessment, you would use something like workplace risk assessment and control diagram or chart to tabulate those sort of things, because on those diagrams you rank the risk with and without controls. And you can then assess the relative risk with additional controls in place. So to me this diagram serves a purpose, but it's not a true bow tie, and it's certainly not a true rack diagram.
All right. Without getting hung up, I don't want us to get hung up on the title, whether it's a true bow tie or not. Your point, as I understand it, is a broader one, that if that's the document that is said to be the safety assessment of the major mining hazard of mine fires, then it doesn't meet the requirements as you've set them out of the regulation.
Well, in attempting to understand the development and assignment of controls and the management of risk, I was not able to follow from that diagram and the documentation how they were developed, and to identify the reasons for adopting or rejecting risk controls that were adopted in that process.
Now, last night, just when you thought you were going to get an early night before giving evidence, you were provided with a further bundle of documents by the inquiry solicitors, which had been provided to us by our friends at GDF Sewers yesterday. They're the documents that are...
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Rosen, but I have to correct that. These are documents that were provided in May. If they were not provided to Professor Cliff, that's another question. But this constant criticism of the position of GDF Sewers is reaching a position of unfairness that I need to comment on and correct. I ask the tribunal to note that.
I stand corrected. They were provided in response to the summons, but they certainly have not been specifically referred to in response to the letters that we have requested documents in relation to the safety management system. But I stand corrected. The documents that were provided to you last night, which are now Exhibit 89 in these proceedings, and I think a bundle's been provided to you. Have you had an opportunity to look at those?
I have.
And do they alter your view about whether or not the safety assessment represented in the bow tie diagram and its attachment, and if you take into account these documents as well, do they alter the view that you've expressed in your report about whether or not the what is said to be the safety assessment of major mining hazard fires meets the requirements of the regulation?
I think in terms of the safety assessment process for major mining hazards,
Yes.
I think they provide a basis for that, yes.
Okay. Do they address the issue of a fire in the worked-out batters of the mine?
No, because they only refer to multiple fatality and under the major mining hazard feature. So, if, for example, I won't bore you with the spreadsheets and the numbers, but they talk about things like potential loss of life, and they do all these spreadsheets based mathematical ranking systems and calculations solely based on the potential for loss of life of employees. Now, that only refers, therefore, to that one outcome, not to any other outcome, and therefore managing the level of risk due to a mine fire is not fully addressed by this sort of assessment.
If we can go back to your report at page 8, please, in the second last paragraph on that page. You say there it's not possible to specify every detail of this safety assessment process in legislation, but it relies upon the effective implementation of the processes by the mining company. You refer there to the certification of GDF sewers under the standard that you've just referred to. Then you say the role of the regulator is to provide oversight of this process, not to drive or manage the process for the company. Can you explain what you mean by that, please?
The fundamental basis of Australian occupational health and safety legislation is a process-based legislation. It is not prescriptive, it is not, well, there are some rules, but there are very few rules. So it is not possible for a regulator to oversight every detail unless it sees every detail. What a regulator normally does, in my experience, is to oversight the process to ensure that adequate process is in place. So they can look at a risk assessment process to make sure that it was followed according to legislation. They can't be expected to understand every hazard at every mine site because they might only visit there once a month or wherever, or once every couple of months. The primary responsibility and the aim is on management and people who should manage at a company.
You then go on and refer to prescriptive legislation and the deficiencies that you identify there in prescriptive legislation, I think are well known and underlie the move to a performance-based approach to management of health and safety risks, do they not?
The prescription legislation is a race to the minimum standard, and every time there's a new disaster, if you take America, for example, they bring out more rules and they prevent that disaster from happening, sort of. But you look at the comparison of safety statistics in America, mining in America is about 5 to 10 times more hazardous than mining in Australia, and their inspectorate there is a bunch of traffic police who issue tickets and fines and don't do anything to encourage good behaviour or improvement.
I think you've been in the hearing room today when Mr Palmier was giving evidence about the explanation for the removal of the pipework in the Northern Batters area and its non-replacement. As I understood the evidence, it was said to be, well, that was all that was required by the code that he referred to. Is that an example of a prescriptive code where minimum compliance with the code was the justification for a particular action? Is that an example of what you're talking about?
Compliance with the code is no thinking, you just follow the recipe.
Yes.
It doesn't evaluate the risk or the effectiveness of anything, you just do as you're told. So that is following a code is appropriate to the safety culture at the time, probably.
And can you contrast that approach with what you would see as a preferable or desirable approach to the management of that risk, the risk of fire in that worked out area of the mine?
Well, it's a question of degree, but having done the risk assessment process thoroughly, you would develop your own guidelines and based upon other people's experience as well. So there will be a lot more industry or company-based plans, which they already have, but it would cover the detail within the company plans rather than through some legislation or pseudo legislation.
On page 9, you make reference to enforcement policies, and you contrast the enforcement policy in place in Victoria, as set out in the published document, WorkSafe Compliance and Enforcement Policy, with the Mines Inspectorate Compliance Policy in Queensland. And I want to understand from you the differences, as you see it, between the approach reflected in the two documents.
I think if I can focus on the enforcement period, perhaps probably the best way of looking at it. In Queensland and New South Wales,
Perhaps if we could just have that on the screen.
if you can just scroll down a little bit, please. The pointed issue here is that in the mines inspectorates in Queensland and New South Wales and their departmental websites and other things, you'll see a much more overt emphasis on support, coercion, advice and encouragement. And also when that doesn't work, there is a gradation of corrective actions that the inspectors can enforce.
Yes.
And those corrective actions are directly correlated with the level of risk that is evinced by the incident or event that they're seeking to correct. So if it's a very minor event, such as perhaps your fire extinguisher is out of test by date, that may well be just a recommendation in the mine record book. So please fix that. No more than that. If it's something a little bit more serious, in Queensland you would have a substandard conditional practice notice issued, which is fixed this by a certain date.
That's an SCP, is it? Yes, thank you.
If it's more severe, if the level of risk is more severe, then the Queensland Inspector would issue a directive. And there are 7 distinct directives that are targeted towards specific levels of risk. Where the level of risk is immediate to life, then their directive is to shut the pit or part of that pit until the risk is fixed. There are also directives relating to improving the safety and health management system, to undertaking specific engineering tests to demonstrate you have a required level of safety, to require adequate training and competency of individuals. There's a couple more, I forget them off the top of my head. Now the reason I promote those is because they are directly correlatable to the risk appreciated and what the inspector sees. And they have closeout dates and they are escalatable. It's a terrible word, I apologise for that, but if they don't get complied by a due date. By comparison, if I look at the enforcement policy from WorkSafe Victoria, they talk about either their improvement notice or their prohibition notice. And that comes straight out of the General IHS legislation, which is really set up for small business, not for major entities. And my personal belief is that protocol is not as suitable as dealing with major mines.
And why is that? What is it about major mines that sets them apart in your view?
Major mines, like major hazardous facilities, is the complexity, and also the need to have the variety of the issues to deal with, and it's relating the response to the level of risk more overtly.
Underneath the pyramid, you make reference to ongoing debate in Australia about whether a general mining inspectorate is the best place to locate the regulatory function in relation to occupational health and safety, or whether you're better to have mining occupational health and safety dealt with in a general occupational health and safety inspectorate. You make the point about training and background of inspectors, and you say that in the major mining states, which I take it to be Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australia, the inspectors tend to be ex-mine managers with extensive mining experience, and you contrast that with the situation in Victoria, whilst recognising that there are mining engineers in what you refer to as the major hazards group, but I think it's been referred to as the Earth Resources Unit in the evidence before the inquiry. What's the significance of the background of inspectors in relation to the mining industry? What's the point you're making there?
There are 2 issues. The most important issue is the capacity of a government inspector to provide advice that will be listened to by the industry. And to do that, you must be a peer. You must have the same background or experience or better to be able to provide that advice. If you are simply a trained inspector with very limited exposure to the mining industry, my experience is that mining industry people don't take them seriously. And so you end up with them being policemen or issuing fines and tickets and infringements, rather than promoting better health and safety performance. And so, because our inspectors in Queensland and West Australia and New South Wales are ex-mine managers, they have the rapport, they have the knowledge and understanding to explain things and address things in a manner which is compatible with and understandable by and accepted by the mining industry. Now, the second issue is, should they be in the IHS department or a separate department? And that often comes down to more bureaucratic argument over pay scales and access to specialisation. And they tried moving them in WA out of the mines department into DOSET, which is Department of Communities Employment and something else. and planning, and they moved them back into the mines department because industry, the workers and the government found that they were not as effective that way.
So do I understand you be saying that in Western Australia they went through a similar process to what occurred here in 2008 of the regulator of health and safety in mines moving from the mines department into a general OHS regulatory department or agency, but that was not a successful exercise and they've gone back into the mines department. Is that right?
That's my understanding. The argument about combining is that in modern mines, many occupations are the same as any industry. Welding's welding and scaffolding is painting's painting. And so the argument is, well, any OHS inspector can inspect those functions and attitudes adequately. And so therefore you can pool resources which are tight, especially in the states where there are relatively few mines, and therefore inherently there are very few mining dedicated inspectors. You actually can broaden the resource available. That didn't work out that way in WA when they tried that. It didn't seem to function effectively.
Right. You draw on your experience in New Zealand. At the top of page 10 of your report, you refer to the Pike River mine disaster as highlighting issues that confront an OHS inspectorate that has a small mining industry to manage. And that's probably an appropriate description of the Victorian scenario. What are those issues? Well, what were the issues that were highlighted in the Pike River case?
Well, in New Zealand, there were actually only 2 inspectors of mines for New Zealand. And in New Zealand, there were, at that stage, 5 underground coal mines.
Yes.
Underground coal mines are peculiar places, require very specialist knowledge to manage and to inspect adequately. It is very difficult for one man who has to do quarries, open-cut mines, and also underground mines to have that broad understanding and the level of detail required to assess the adequacy of the systems and management processes. And so it's manifestly impossible for that one person to do that role and keep up to date, especially when they're a very, very small department. There was problems with funding and flexibility and training and relative pay scales. But if they're any good at their job, they go back into industry because the industry would pay them a lot more than being a mines inspector. So there's a lot of the recommendations that come out of the Pike River Royal Commission deal with the resourcing of the inspectors and the specialisation and the training. And now, for example, they've set up a relationship with the major mining states in Australia to benefit from the expertise that exists in those states and to do exchanges with them and to call on their expertise as required to enhance their capacity to inspect the mines in New Zealand.
As I understand what you say in your report, you say that ultimately, whilst location might be significant, it's the effectiveness of the inspectorate that's really the issue rather than the bureaucratic location of a regulator.
Absolutely. The capacity of an inspector to assess and provide meaningful advice on the risks in the mines.
All right. The final point you make in that section of your report at the end of the first paragraph on page 10 is that you seem to be reminding the inquiry that whilst focus on the regulator is obviously important, the primary responsibility for the management of risks rests with the operator, in this case GDF Sewers, not the inspectorate.
Well, I've been through a number of these sort of inquiries, now number 3 or 4, and I'm always underwhelmed by the fact that the government gets beaten around the head because they caused the disaster. Now, I don't think that's appropriate. They have a role in the thing, but they're only there, inspectors are there 1 or 2 days a month. They don't have primary carriage of the responsibility for health and safety at a mine site, in my view.
In the next paragraph on page 10, you talk about risk assessments, and after referring to a number of guidance documents concerning the conduct of risk assessments and risk management in the mining industry, you say this in the middle of that paragraph: a risk assessment is only as good as the information used as input and the expertise of the personnel involved in the risk assessment. Could you expand on that, please, Professor?
There's the real danger when you do risk assessments to indulge in groupthink. To make a risk assessment meaningful, you must have access to an adequate knowledge base of what can happen, what has happened, and be able to critically assess real scenarios rather than focus on some things that all the group knows about is very limited. So they weren't here 5 years ago, so they don't know what happened more than 5 years ago. Or they're only all open cut mines and mining underground or something, or they don't have the background to understand that. Also, they don't have the knowledge, for example, of specialist control techniques that may be applicable that they may not have seen because they're not being exposed to them in their mine. Because I'm not want to pick on brown coal miners, but it's like open cut versus underground. Brown coal is different to black coal, so therefore they don't look at what black coal does, maybe, and vice versa. So there's a danger, I'm not saying this has happened necessarily, but there's a danger that there isn't adequate canvassing of information and an adequate rigour in the risk assessment process, and that you tend to, there is a capacity for risks to be minimised rather than adequately assessed.
We can move on then to your assessment of the GDF sewers documents, if I could call them that were provided to you. You deal with this issue as questions 5, 6 and 7 in a group starting on page 11, where you set out an extract from the 1984 Latrobe Valley Open Cuts Fire Protection Policy. That's a document that the previous witness, Mr Polmere, was referring to, and you would have noted that you've set out sections 1.1.4 and 1.1.5 of that document. And if we can go over to page 12 of your report, about a quarter of the way down the page, so immediately after the italics ends, you say, this then sets the baseline from which future plans would be developed. Any variations to these controls should be documented in the appropriate risk assessments. What do you mean by the baseline from which future plans would be developed?
Well, if you could, like, this document appears to be what was the accepted standard at that time for the management of the mine fire risks. So I would have expected normally, based on my experience in the mining industry, that as plans are then modified, as they go forward, updated, reviewed or changed, that they would be modified from that baseline, from that point. So that if they decide not to do something, they'd say, we're not going to do this because we're going to do this instead, or because it's no longer necessary. So it's an explicable chain of events and chain of consequences and changes to any plans or operations.
So to take a specific example, the evidence that was given about the removal of the corroded pipework that Mr Polmere gave evidence about, what would you expect to see accompanying a decision like that, the removal of fire protection pipework in a particular part of the mine?
Well, I would have looked for an explanation or demonstration that the removal of those pipes doesn't contribute to any reduction in the level of safety and the effectiveness of the controls. Why they can do that without compromising the safety or other outcomes, consequences of that mine because of mine fire.
Is it sufficient from your point of view to say, well, we did it, we didn't have to have them there under the code, so that's why they weren't there?
No. To me, there's no science behind that. There's no risk evaluation analysis behind that. To say we don't need to, we don't do it because we don't have to, is not a management technique.
You then go on and deal with the document that I've already asked you about, and I don't want to go over that ground again. That is the Major Mining Hazard 7 mine fire document. You say there that it doesn't provide any detail of the process of risk assessment undertaken. You've already talked to us about that. And halfway through that same paragraph, starting the fundamental issue, you say fire in the abandoned areas is not treated as, I think that should be a specific hazard. Why I assume you say it should be, that's something you would expect to see identified expressly? Is that right?
In my experience in dealing with mine fire risk assessments and mine fire management plans in other states, they are location dependent and scenario specific. And I would suggest that from the reports of mine fires that have been provided to me, that a fire in an abandoned area is a particular type of mine fire that needs to be managed. In an abandoned area, yes, needs to be managed.
We know from the evidence before the inquiry that in 2005 and in 2008 there were significant fires, not on this scale, but certainly significant fires in the worked out areas of the Hazelwood coal mine. How, from the point of view of best practice health and safety management, how should information like that be fed into a risk assessment process? What would you like to see done with that sort of information by an operator of a mine such as this?
Well, as I alluded to in, I think, the last paragraph on page 12, I would have used the fact that the circumstance of those fires and say, how could these fires occur, and given the overt recognition of adverse weather conditions and also the concern over flying embers, that would be a scenario that can cause an fire in the abandoned areas. And therefore, the question would be asked, are we controlling that risk adequately at the current period of time? Or if not, how do we improve that level of control? I could not find that analysis.
And turn then to page 13 of your report, please. There's a heading, Previous Fires at the Mine. The three final questions that you were asked to set out there, numbered 8, 9 and 10. You were asked specifically to examine 4 reports that were prepared by consultants to the operator of the Hazelwood mine relating to fires in December 2005, October 2006, September 2008 and January 2012. And you state in the middle of page 13, these reports represent competent assessments of what happened, what went wrong and what could be improved to prevent or mitigate these incidents should they occur in the future. You go on, there is very limited consideration of the implications of these incidents for other types of fires or the potential for fire in general. This is particularly true for the controls that were found to be ineffective. What are you referring to there? What's lacking that you refer to as being a limited consideration of implications for other fires?
In my view, the analysis is very much based on what happened at the actual incident. So what the initiating was, how it propagated in that circumstance. The question was not then asked, well, okay, what about if it's happened in a slightly different area? What the implication of the spread of the fire? In a number of those examples, the fire spread in the coal seam very rapidly. Now, okay, the initiation may have been a hot bearing on a rock conveyor belt or something like that, but that means, okay, what happens if we had a different sort of ignition source? Could that cause fire elsewhere? What are the implications for that? Also, when there are controls that are found to be ineffective due to power failure or low water pressure and those sort of things which were reported in those incidents, those did not seem to me to be being addressed. Okay, what does that mean in going forward? What are the risks of that happening again under similar scenarios in the future?
You note in the 5 dot points towards the bottom of page 13 that there are a number of features of the reports which reveal previous incidents that are relevant to this inquiry, and you make a note of several of those. And then towards the bottom of the page you make specific reference to the report into the September 2008 fire, that there's been some evidence led. And you note that the report highlights the issue of rapid escalation of the fire due to IPRH, or mine operator personnel, being unable to mount an effective initial response as the non-operational areas have very difficult access and there are insufficient firefighting facilities available. And you are aware, aren't you, Professor, that the fire that this inquiry is examining features or has similar features to those two that were identified for the 2008 fire? Well,
that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I understand that.
It has happened before. It is recognised what was done to prevent that happening again.
Precisely. You then go on to make references to further aspects of that report, and then finally you note recommendation 6 of the various recommendations made in the report at the top of page 14, that a risk assessment should be undertaken on the non-operational areas to determine if further prevention work is required. The risk assessment should include a cost-benefit analysis. You note that you have not seen such a document. I take it that was something you were expecting to see in the documentation that that had been provided?
I would have expected to see the document, because if a recommendation is made, I would have thought the recommendation would be followed through, and therefore I could see. I was hoping that would explain to me why the pipework wasn't put back in the operational areas and all the other changes were made, and to show that they had assessed the risk and decided the level of risk was acceptable for fire in the non-operational area.
It's the case, isn't it, that often or sometimes an organisation that gets a report like this doesn't necessarily implement all of the recommendations. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Best practice, though, would be presumably that if you're not going to implement a recommendation like that, that there would be some record of the thinking, if you like, of why it was not implemented, what other alternative arrangements were made and the like.
I'd expect so, yes.
Now, I should indicate to the inquiry at this point that we have received a further statement from Mr Prezioso of GDF Sewers, and he does address this issue, and it's anticipated that we will call Mr Prezioso tomorrow. You then go on and make reference to two other fires, and I don't need to take you to those. And then there's a heading discussion, and I just want to ask you briefly about this. This is a general discussion about the issues that you have been considering in the report. Is that right?
Yes, focusing on the incidents in the past and the implications given the current incident.
Okay. And you make the point in the first paragraph, the concluding sentence, that focus seems to be on preventing the incident being investigated rather than on any broader implications. And I think that was the point that you were just making, was it not, about the reports in general?
They're very tactical in their outcome, yes.
All right. At the bottom of the page, you make a reference to catastrophic risk assessments, and you go on in the remainder of your report to say a few things about that. What does that? Is that a term of art? Catastrophic risk assessment. What does that mean?
We use that generally to separate risks that have potential for significant harm, like multiple fatality or very, very large economic or health effects, from limited events. For example, a lot of this major mining hazard stuff is actually not catastrophic because it involves one person or two people, and they are frequent events that can occur that may have significant harm on one occasion. A catastrophe is a major fire, explosion, inundation, high wall failure, those sorts of events. They are, by their nature, very rare, and therefore there is a challenge in making an effective assessment, because people tend to say, when you do the assessment, they always tend to underestimate the likelihood.
Yes.
And they always tend to underestimate the consequence. The classic semi-quantitative risk assessment 5x5 matrix, which I'm sure you've probably been through multiple times, people don't like putting the highest consequence, number 5, there, because it automatically means they've got to do something about it. And also they tend to say things like, it hasn't happened here, we don't know about it, so it's lowest likelihood. Because catastrophic events by their nature occur very rarely. In Brisbane, for example, we have had 2 1 in 100 year floods in the last 3 years. They are catastrophic events, they are extremely rare, and if you ask someone to do a risk assessment, they say, well, they're 1 in 100 years, we had 2 in the last 3. So that's the thing about catastrophic events. It is very fraught to use simple statistics to predict them, which is why dealing with catastrophic events using some of the stuff that, for example, Quest did in this report is of limited value, because prioritising and putting numbers against them is a challenge. It is better to simplify the ranking scales and to do it that way. It is also necessary because of the complexity of catastrophic events. They're often a chain of events, and they can be quite a complicated chain of events, to be able to identify that chain of events and the consequences. So I think you've had the Swiss cheese model as well. So a catastrophic event often may require a large number of pieces of cheese to line up, whereas other events may want 1 or 2. The difficulty is that people don't recognise those slices, and they can line up, then they won't consider them a risk.
Ms Petering is a big fan of the Swiss cheese model, and I know a little bit about it, but there might be a few people in the room that are struggling with the cheese metaphor. Can you just perhaps explain that for the lay listener, Professor?
Well, it's the 2 dimensions of the concept. In the simplest form, if you have an unwanted energy release, and again, you have a target, then you have barriers between the energy and the target, and these are the controls. Now, no control is perfect, so they relate effectively the control to a piece of Swiss cheese with a hole in it, so that the energy can pass through the hole if it lines up, but then it hits the next piece of cheese And if that piece of cheese has a solid part there that doesn't go through. But if it also happens to line up, it goes through that. So you have a number of these pieces of cheese in a line, and if they all line up, then the catastrophe or the event occurs. And that's why it's James' reason it's called a Swiss cheese model.
So
it has more to that, however, than that, in that it also talks about, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm doing an undergraduate lecture, I apologise, but...
and I feel like an undergraduate professor, it's even worse.
Each piece of cheese is characterised by a different type of control. So, for example, you have the individual involved in the incident as one piece of cheese or one category of cheese. You have environmental factors as the second piece of cheese. You have organisational factors as the third. Then you have regulatory and external variables as the fourth set of cheese. And so they all contain the different categories of control as well in that model. That's what James' reason talks about.
Okay, can we leave cheese for a moment, come back to coal mines and just apply that here? So if I understand you, the initiating, sticking with the facts as we know them, assuming that embers entered the mine, that's the initiating event. And then we've got a series of possible, what was your expression? Controls, which would prevent that becoming a fire and the disaster that we know ultimately occurred. Yeah. One might be the availability of the CFA to attend and help put the fire out, for example.
Yes.
But if, because of circumstances, they are engaged in other activities, then that control wouldn't work, and that's the first hole that we go through.
Well, that's the mitigating control, so it's actually on the other side of the bow tie. But yes, it's probably the latter one. The prevention of it actually becoming an event would be, well, I don't want to sort of stir the pot too late in the day, but, covering the coal with a inert material so it can't actually be ignited.
Yes, okay.
Or the fact that the forest wasn't actually there in the first place, so it couldn't be set fire. Hierarchical control prevention is better, absolutely better, okay. Or the fact that the coal was wetted down so it couldn't be ignited.
I understand.
Then, okay, there's an ignition, but then the fire couldn't propagate. So you'd look at controls such as the paddocking that you talked about, where you have the physical barriers along I've got to use Victorian jargon, the batter, we'll call it, rather than the high wall.
Yes.
So that actually stops it propagating along the face of the coal. So that's another barrier to propagation, to exacerbation. And then you'd have the firefighting, the various types of firefighting and control and mitigation techniques involved there as well. And each of those is a control. Each of them is less than perfect, so each would have a hole. Sometimes that hole can be in different sizes, and so, yes. Understand.
Going to the final...
I enjoyed that, Mr. Rosen, thank you.
It's the word assisting in council assisting. Page 15 of your report, Professor Cliff, 3 lines down, you say there's no doubt that reprofiling the abandoned areas and capping would be extremely expensive and take significant resources and time. It is, however, the only way of ensuring that such events cannot occur. Do I understand you there to be referring to what's been discussed today in the evidence earlier as a rehabilitation, complete rehabilitation of the batters, or are you talking about something else when you talk about capping?
Well, permanent rehabilitation is the ultimate solution, which has to be done anyway, so there's I suppose, rather than doing it multiple times, but it is quite common, for example, in other areas where we have stockpiles or waste heaps which have a tendency for spontaneous combustion to be capped temporarily. But that's, again, cost comes and availability of materials comes into play there. But fundamentally, if the coal can't be exposed to air, it can't burn. It's as simple as that.
We've had some evidence, and I think you heard it being discussed with the previous witness with Mr. Faithfull this morning, of perhaps short of rehabilitation being able to apply some fire retardant material to the batters so as to reduce or remove the risk of them igniting in the event of a fire. Are you able to assist the inquiry at all with any research you might have done in relation to such matters?
I have been present at mine fires, both underground and surface, where we have used a range of materials, much more limited geographically in their spread. We have used fly ash slurries, we've used foams, gels, we've used organic surfactant materials, polymers, to bind the surface. Bituminous tar is used quite routinely on coal stockpiles, for example, to provide a seal on the surface to reduce the effective surface area, prevent air ingress. They're all theoretically possible.
Yes.
They all have practical difficulties in achieving them. in limitations that can do them. To them, and they all cost money. They take time. They need resources. They have to be applied and maybe reapplied to be effective. There was a comment made about we want to watch the surface of the batters to watch them so in case they break.
Mr. Faithful raised that concern that if we covered the surfaces, we couldn't observe any potential batter stability issues.
I would merely observe that there are a number of other techniques for monitoring the stability of high walls that we use through our coal mines in Australia. So that may not necessarily be a barrier to using a sealant of some sort to reduce the oxidation potential of the coal in abandoned areas.
What specifically are you referring to techniques?
Well, there's a number of techniques we use routinely in Queensland, New South Wales. There's ground penetrating radar. There's three-dimensional laser scanning systems that measure the stability of the high wall, and then they do it on a periodic basis so you can see how much it's moved with very good resolution. There's also other techniques of using various optical and instrumented techniques to measure the sort of movements you're talking about. It's
fair to say, isn't it, Professor, that a properly conducted risk assessment into the issue would explore the pros and cons of the various possibilities in line with that regulation that we looked at about identifying control measures and so on?
That would be something you would do. If you identify this as a potential control, you then look at its effectiveness, and also part of the ethics will be, can you apply it and what do you lose in applying that technology?
Finally, Professor, I have to ask you about black swans, your final paragraph. We've had reference to elephants and canaries, and now we can add black swans to that list of animals. What are you talking about when you say the key to effective catastrophic risk management is to be looking for the black swans?
Okay. The whole point about risk management and risk assessment is not looking backwards, but looking forward and predicting what's going to happen in the future. And the classic analogy that risk management people use is the black swan. The black swan is something which was unique to Western Australia. So when the English settlers first arrived in Western Australia, they saw swans that were black. Now they, by definition, believe swans to be white, therefore they didn't believe they were swans. So if you don't recognise something or aren't prepared to recognise something as a problem, then you won't. So we have to be prepared for the unexpected, in other words, a swan which is black, not white. And so with risk assessment, it is not about actual events, but it's looking at the series of circumstances of precursors or combinations of events that can cause issues. Generically, and nothing to do with the current incident, the thrust of risk management now is moving towards not failure of systems, but systems that don't fail, that operate normally but behave in unexpected ways and cause accidents and incidents because we didn't expect them to work in a certain way.
That concludes the questions I have for Professor Cliff. I note the time. Do members of the board have any questions at this time? Ms. Petering, your light is on.
Thank you. On this page, number 15, Professor Cliff, and thank you for your evidence today, you were talking about the costs. So profiling the abandoned areas and capping would be extremely expensive and take significant resource and time. Is there a range? I appreciate it's difficult because how long is a piece of string, and I know that you have been to the mine. Is there a range of, understanding of what the parameters are in both rehabilitation or reprofiling abandoned areas and capping, or is it just too hard to predict? Is there a per hectare rate or?
Well, there's a number of factors. I mean, a number of these factors were discussed today. You need to have a suitable material to cap with, ideally a clay. We talk about a clay because it's not poor. It's very dense. It doesn't allow air to pass through it. You need to have a suitable source of a suitable material, and you'd need, now we talk about 1 metre thick, but if you look at a lot of the research that CSIRO has carried out for things like stockpiles and abandoned waste heaps, they talk about 5 metres thick. Now, if you're talking about the northern batters, which are 2 kilometres long, say 100 metres high, you're talking about an area roughly 300,000 square metres at least to cap. You're talking about million tonnes of rock, a suitable material that won't run and flow away, expand, all the wrong things. So that's a very expensive. You've got to find ways of doing that. With the haul trucks I saw at the mine site, that's an awful lot of haul truck trips. Maybe conveyor belts can do that. But so you are looking at finding materials. You've got to compact it. You've then got to get the vegetation to grow to bind it after time. That's all a very expensive operation to do. The one thing is that they do have some material in pit. They do dump in pit, which is moving any distance is a real expense. But it is a very complex, it's not a trivial exercise to do.
You spoke about, thank you, you spoke about the best practice in undertaking risk assessments and looking for black swans. So with a view to sort of looking forward about how can we prevent things like this happening, how does an organisation undertake a thorough risk assessment? Is it sort of bringing people in that aren't necessarily in the industry? You were saying before about perhaps even looking at things that they do in the black coal. How does a company undertake a thorough risk assessment, examining things that they may not have thought about?
The key to a risk assessment is an adequate cross-section of expertise. Now, brown coal is peculiar to Victoria in its own way. So GDFCU is probably internally within their own company have a lot of engineering expertise. But there is expertise beyond that. And so, for example, the nature of propagation of fires, the control of fires, firefighting technology, minimisation, I would be expecting them to use external expertise as well, like they do in other states. Also, tapping into the current knowledge base on technology and control of fires and minimisation. There is a world of research funded by the Australian Coal Association about black coal, absolutely, but it talks about coal fires, a lot of the stuff on coal fires. We talk about a lot of the retardants and gels and sealants and capping. There's an awful lot of research, for example, funded by ACARP on stockpile fire prevention, spontaneous management, waste heat management, capping, materials to use for that detection. You talked about detecting open cut fires. Well, there is a number of optical techniques, even video cameras, thermal infrared, all research done that is available for that sort of thing if you look around.
And perhaps just lastly, I guess, is it your expert opinion that the risk of the fire in the worked-out Battersea mine was not adequately recognised?
I think all things being considered, I would say yes, it wasn't adequately recognised.
Was not adequately recognised?
No.
Thank you.
I have one question, which is not so much about the technical aspects, but the role of executive management in keeping their finger on the pulse of issues with regards to safety and fire risk. What is your advice to us about what is best practice for the CEO of relevant companies or the very top of the management system to monitor, track the prevention and mitigation scenarios that we've discussed, particularly with regard to fire risk? And I'm thinking here, are there appropriate KPIs or executive dashboards, or what's the best practice that you've observed within the mining industry to monitor the effectiveness of control strategies like this?
I think the answer relates much less to tactical issues like controls and this thing, and much more to the demonstration, creation of an environment and an atmosphere at the mine where the management of health and safety and the mitigation of risks is positively encouraged and supported overtly, and not even accidentally undermined. And the example I would classically give would be something like where there will be, I don't wish to insult the senior management at GDF Suez at all, but it's possible in any mining company, for example, there to be a policy about health and safety signed by the CEO on the wall. And yet, when you go, like for example, when I go underground, the last thing I see when I go underground is how many tonnes are being produced that shift. So the message the workforce get is, okay, that's on the wall, but the thing that's in my face all the time is production. And so the management team have to be very careful not to send mixed messages and to ensure that they do encourage and demonstrate by example that in fact if people want to take 3 days to do a risk assessment rather than one, it's going to cost a lot more money, for example, that's okay because that's appropriate. And that's the support they give. And there's been a lot of argument, for example, in the Ritter report in WA that came out in the early 2000s after 5 fatalities in northwest Australia in the mining industry up there, where there was a clear identification that there was a conflict of safety culture between the messages leaving the top, where zero harm was our top priority, and it was truly believed, and by the time we got down through middle management, the production message had overshadowed that. And there's a danger that people will interpret what people say, and so they'll say we can't do it because it costs too much money, it's going to take too long, it's not productive. We are in times now, for example, where money is very tight everywhere, And so there are tendencies to cut corners and things. And that may not be the intention of the senior executives, but they have to be very particularly careful now to make sure that people realise that's not their intention.
Conscious of the time, Ms Doyle tells me she's got 20 to 30 minutes of questions for Professor Cliff. I know Professor Cliff's probably keen to get away. I'm not quite sure. No, apparently there's flexibility there. I'm in your hands.
I think there's some further witnesses who have to be heard tomorrow, and if it hadn't been for those I have said to go over tomorrow, I think the circumstances may be better to just get you home. But we may take a short break. Okay.
We'll press on. No short break? No short break. All right.
Yeah, Professor Cliff, when Mr Rosen was asking you about your experience in New Zealand and New South Wales and Queensland, you made the point that you had some experience in relation to combustion with respect to brown coal, but I think if I heard your answer, you said that was limited to 3 years lab work at the CSIRO, was that right?
That's correct.
And you said that your exposure to Victorian open-cut brown coal mines was limited.
Yes.
Can I take it from that then that you haven't been involved in working on a safety assessment process with respect to an open-cut brown coal mine?
That's correct.
And I take it also that you have not been involved in preparing or working on rehabilitation plans for an open-cut brown coal mine?
No, I have not.
Now, I want to take you to the opinion you express on page 8 of your report, if you can go to that.
Yes.
At the time you wrote this report, you expressed a particular view about compliance by GDF sewers with the conditions in Regulation 5.3.23. I want to unpick that a little in light of what's happened since. Professor Cliff, when you wrote this opinion here, the only document that you had regard to was the only one that you understood that you had access to at the time. It's a document that in some of the materials is referred to as tab 26, but it is the bow tie diagram that you were taken to by Mr Rosen, is that right?
Yes.
The second thing that underpinned the opinion as you expressed it then was, if I understood your evidence correctly, at the time you wrote this, you had not fully appreciated that in Victoria, the requirement under this regulation to perform a safety assessment regime is limited to major mining hazards as opposed to all mining hazards. Is that right?
Yes, offensively, I suppose you could say it, yes.
Yes, because as I understood your answers, what you were looking for was the application of the safety assessment regime to the broader suite of mining hazards as you know them because of your experience in Queensland and New South Wales. But on reflection in Victoria, this requirement is confined to major mining hazards as defined.
The safety assessment process is yes. The risk assessment process I don't believe
No,
is.
that's right, but I'm asking you about that.
Yes.
Because the opinion you express here is tied back to Regulation 5.3.23. So I'm asking you in that way.
Yes.
Now, I just want to ask you about the next element. You had a look at the document, the bow tie document, in order to express the view here. And you said to Mr Rosen that you don't think that the document you were given is the same as the sort of bow tie documents that you've seen in other places or that you would like to see as best practice.
That's correct.
Of course, Professor Cliff, a bow tie assessment is not a legislative or regulatory requirement. We don't find that language in the Act or the regs, do we?
No.
It's simply a mode that has become adopted and might have even become common practice in the mining industry, a mode of meeting requirements with respect to safety assessments and risk assessment. You accept that?
Yes, I do.
And when you looked at that bow tie diagram that you were given, you took the view that it didn't address all of the things that you were used to seeing in respect of safety assessments that you've seen performed interstate.
And that bow tie did not meet the dot points in the regulation, from my understanding.
Okay. Now, since you wrote this report and expressed the opinion on page 8, you've been provided with a larger suite of documents.
Yes.
And among those documents I think it might assist Professor Cliff if he has the list that I've been given most recently today, titled Documents Reviewed
Yes.
by David Cliff. And that has a list of 1 to 26. Mr. Rosen took you to it earlier on today.
That's correct.
Document 16 on that list is described in many different ways in different lists, but I take document 16 to be the bow tie document that we've
Yes.
just been talking about. All
Yeah.
right. That's the only one you had when you expressed this view. Since you expressed this view, you've been given documents 17, 18, 19, 20 and 21 in that list.
That's correct, yes.
And Mr. Rosen asked you whether in light of those you had revisited your view, and you expressed the view that in light of those you now take the view that, and I didn't pick up exactly what you said, but you said that they went towards a safety assessment, I think was your terminology.
As of 2004, these documents would indicate a safety assessment process, yes.
Right. And it looks as though you still haven't been given a 2009 document that addresses the same matters. I can't see it on the list. It may be an error in descriptions, but have you been given a document called Report for Major Mining Hazards Assessment, December 2009, undertaken by consultants GHD?
I'm not aware of that document, no.
Can I just ask that Exhibit 68, that the first page of that be brought up on the screen for Professor Cliff just to confirm? Just so that you can have a look at it. I take it you have not seen this document?
No, I have no recollection of that document at all, no.
Okay. Well, then perhaps I just need to explain it briefly to you without going to the detail of its contents. It is a review conducted in December 2009, which in its early pages says that it builds on the 2003-2004 reports that you have now seen, and says that those who are participating in the workshop that led to the generation of this report were going to look at the existing risks identified as at 03-04 and see whether any of those should be reassessed and see whether any new ones should now be identified and referred to. I'm asking you to assume a lot because you haven't seen it, but Professor Cliff, is that an appropriate way for someone reviewing their safety assessment to go about that process? Build on existing work and renew and review?
Yes, in principle, yes, absolutely.
I want to ask also whether you've seen a document called Safety Management System Manual.
Yes, this morning, yes.
Okay, can we bring up the first page of Exhibit 89? May not have made it to the uploads as yet.
That's Rachel.
No, I think it was at the back of that, yes.
Okay, I've got it here, yes.
Okay.
I think it's not on the system, apparently.
Oh, okay. And so you only saw that this morning, is that right, Professor Cliff?
Yes.
Okay. This Safety Management System Manual, we can't expect you to have become completely familiar with it. It is cross-referenced to a number of other documents. One of them is called Major Mining Hazard Procedure, and it has a template which talks about the process of review that persons who undertake the assessment will undertake or engage in. And it says within it that when scenarios are determined, the controls for preventing a major mining hazard need to be reviewed. Existing controls need to be reviewed. If a control is determined to be no longer valid, the reasons shall be documented and it shall be removed from the scenario. If a new control is determined, it shall be documented. I'm asking you to absorb a lot on the run, but if you accept that the current Safety Management System Manual as it applies at GDF sewers calls on those who are performing safety assessments to do what I've just read out, namely identify controls. If they're not valid, document why. If there's a new one, document why you're adopting it. Does that meet your satisfaction in terms of the criteria that you identified as important under 5.3.23 for a safety assessment?
For a safety assessment, yes. I'd be happy. I'd accept that.
Right. So in light of the things that have happened since you wrote this report, new documentation being made available to you, and you gaining a new appreciation of the differences in the Victorian approach, do you accept that the opinion you expressed there has been superseded? It has been demonstrated to not reveal the entire picture.
It is fair to say that the safety assessment process meets the criteria. I think what is also missed, however, though, is the development of the safety management system under legislation relates to mining hazards as well as major mining hazards. And I've got no evidence of the risk assessments that would underpin them.
Yes, no, I understand that, but I take it then, Professor Cliff, that your real criticism is about the regulatory regime, because you would advocate that Victoria should move towards the New South Wales or Queensland model, namely we should expand the requirement of safety assessments from major mining hazards to more mining hazards, perhaps even all mining hazards. Is that the view you adopt?
Well, what I'm not clear about is why that's not done now, because I would have thought under the legislation in Victoria that requirement is already there, and also if GDS2 is accredited to AS4801, that would also be done because they're accredited to AS4801.
I understand that, Professor Cliff, but you've signed a report which says that GDF Sewers has not complied with a particular regulation, and I'm suggesting to you that you now understand that is not the case. You've got other criticisms, but you now understand that that is not the case.
Yeah, I'm happy to accept that, yes.
I want to ask you about the views you express at page 6 of your report. We need to go back a couple of pages. It really just starts at the bottom of this page 6. Right at the bottom you talk about isolating air supply from coal. This is right at the bottom of page 6. Can only be achieved by covering the coal with an impervious layer, fly ash, clay or overburden, and then over the page it says, generally this requires the application of a layer several metres thick. First of all, I just want to understand the time frame you're talking about there. Is this a method of firefighting that you're describing, or mitigation to avoid the risk of fire well before a fire breaks out?
It's most effective in prevention, to prevent the fire, prevent the air from getting to the coal. You would only smother a fire with a solid material if there's an absence of water, because you retain the heat. So when you dig it out again, if you're going to dig it out again, the fire will come back.
Okay, so this is a fire mitigation proposal that you're making that would be done ahead of a fire season, for example.
It is best applied in advance of the fire, but in a circumstance where there's an active fire, you could use it to smother the fire.
Okay.
It would not be as effective.
Have you done any research or studies on use of fly ash or fly ash mixed with clay and overburden on their application to batters of an open-cut coal mine?
To an open-cut coal mine, I have not personally done, no, but ACARP research projects do relate to those sorts of things, to stockpiles, which would be very closely analogous to the exposed batters, and also to spoil heaps, which are probably not as relative. A variety of capping and sealing materials have been done.
And are you proposing this with respect to batters in their current profile or in batters which have been laid back?
They would be, there's no doubt the lower the angle of repose, the easier it will be to apply various types of materials because of the run on the material. But there have been a number of examples of successful application to vertical and near vertical faces of coal.
And you've been on a tour of this mine. Are you aware of some particular type of machinery that's available to apply, say, a fly ash cement mix to batters as high as those you've seen in this mine?
I think that could be done. I saw
with what machinery?
The fly ash slurries are very similar in consistency, for example, to the foam generators that foam just up with the fire brigade were using. I've pumped fly ash slurries 8 kilometres through a 4-inch pipe, so with a suitable pump. So yes, they could be done quite easily.
And you're suggesting that it be laid over hundreds of metres of exposed coal face prior to it being laid back? It
could be. You'd have to do the risk assessment. Other
well,
issues.
That's it, isn't it? You'd have to do a risk assessment.
Yes, absolutely.
And I asked you about whether you're aware of any studies or any practice in relation to applying the material, but are you aware of any studies in relation to the impact of doing so on batter stability?
Well, in general, applying materials like that, yes, I am, because they actually increase the stability of those batters. I'm not familiar with the word batter very much, but certainly coal faces. And in fact, in underground mines, shotcrete and other materials, the cementatious are actively used to stabilise such faces.
In underground mines?
Yeah, and high walls of open cut mines.
Okay. And have you conducted any analysis of whether application of that material would make it more difficult to detect hotspots or movement in batters?
They are applied to open cut mines in Queensland where they still monitor for movement of the high wall.
And those mines you just referred to in Queensland, they're
Open cut.
Yes, but are they black coal or brown coal?
They're black coal.
Have you undertaken any assessment of the impact of the application of that material on batters which have within them horizontal bores for use in relation to drainage in a situation where there's a need to take account of the pressure in the aquifer?
No, I haven't.
Now, I want to take you to page, I think it's going to be page 11, where you talk about fire policies. When I read page 11, Professor Cliff, and lined it up with the list of documents you were given, it seems to me you haven't been given the 1994 SECB code. Is that right?
I don't think so. I have to check.
No, well, I'll walk you through the document and let you know how I came to that conclusion. You can tell me if it's not right. At page 11, you say, in the document Latrobe Valley Open Cuts Fire Protection Policy, November 1984, so there we know what we're looking at, the 84 policy, and you then set out two passages from it, 1.1.4 and 1.1.5. Just wanted to understand, I don't know if this has been changed in your reviewed report. No, it hasn't. If we can take that up a little bit higher, there's a passage that starts, this report draws, under 1.1.5, if we keep moving.
Yes.
No. We were quoting... Okay, keep going. Where it says this report draws upon, it's just a little confusing because it's still in italics. That's where you cease to quote from the policy, and these are your words again?
Yes, sorry, it could well be. Yeah, yes, because it's not in quotes. Yes, you're quite right.
Yes, okay. And then we move over to page 12, and in the text, about a third of the way down, it says, this then sets the baseline from which... Now, Mr Rosen took you to that, but what we need to understand then is that the baseline you're talking about at that point in your report is the 1984 policy, yes?
Correct, yes.
Do you understand that that was itself replaced by a 1994 policy developed at that time by the owners of the operators of brown coal mines in Victoria prior to privatisation?
I think it was mentioned today during the hearing as Generation Victoria or something.
Okay, so Professor Cliff, you've looked at the 1984 SECB policy and the 2013 GDF sewers policy, but one bridge you're missing is the intervening document, the 1994 document. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so you haven't had the opportunity to see the progression of the conditions in 84 to 94 to 2013?
The conditions?
The conditions set out in that code, or the prescriptions set out in that code? Okay. Can I take you then to page 13? And in the paragraph second from the top where you refer to Doc ID, Mine Fire Service Policy Code of Practice, as I understand it, you're now talking about the GDF Sewers 2013 Code of Practice, because the numbers seem to match, section 3.4.
Yes, I used the document identification number from it.
And you say the measures contain some of those recommended in the SECV document discussed above, except the reprofiling options and covering with overburden. So just pausing there, what you're comparing the GDF Sewers 2013 document to is the 1984 version. You accept that?
Yeah, I accept that.
And insofar as you refer to except reprofiling and covering with overburden, those aren't things that are in the requirements of the 84 code. Those are things that are attached in the discussion paper towards the back of the code. You appreciate that?
I'll take your word for that.
Well, it's not that the 1984 code says that those options of reprofiling and covering with overburden are part of the fire protection policy on their own, is it?
Well, my understanding they were recommended in the document.
Okay. I want to take you to, it's on the same page, the question on page 13 about past reviews of fires, and you refer there to some of the reviews you were given and some of your views about those. Over on page 14, your attention was directed to a particular recommendation emanating from a 2008 review. And you say that you haven't seen a risk assessment emanating from that. Now, Mr. Rosen mentioned when you were asked questions earlier that a statement of Mr. Prezioso that obviously you haven't seen. I take it from the list of documents you also haven't seen a letter from the solicitors from GDF Sewers setting out in numbered paragraph form matters that have occurred since that 2008 recommendation was made.
No, I have not.
Okay, so you haven't had the opportunity to consider that and line it up against the recommendation?
No, I have not.
I want to take you to page 14. The part where you refer to... Just have to pick up the recommendation, Professor Cliff. It's all right, I can actually leave that recommendation. Now, you were asked towards the end of your evidence about best practice with respect to engagement by CEOs. I don't think this is a document you've seen. You weren't given the statement. Oh, you were given the statement of Mr. Dugan. Do you recall that statement? You may not have had a chance to look at all of the attachments to it.
I got the statement, but I don't think any attachments.
Okay. Well, Annexure 13 to Mr. Dugan's statement is a document titled Fire and Flood Management Systems Weekly Status. I think in the terminology used at the mine, it's known as the RAG report. It's a document that goes to senior management in the mine on a weekly basis. Is that something that you would identify as good practice in terms of keeping senior level of management informed of that particular risk, fire and flood management?
It depends on the purpose of the document. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
I take it you'd agree, rather than documents that report on management of risks being kept to a risk management team for them to all talk about and action, that it's better practice that those documents be sent up the chain to senior management on a regular basis in advance of problems developing.
Yes, I would.
On page 14, when you start the discussion about catastrophic risk assessment, and over the page to the black swan point, you talk about what you assume the risks were that people at GDF Sewers had not acknowledged or not taken into account. But you're aware, aren't you, from one of the documents you were given, this is the document called Guidelines for Season-Specific Fire Preparedness and Mitigation. You're aware, aren't you, that within that document there's a reference to the risk posed by flying embers? I can bring up the particular passage. Exhibit 66, if we're able to get hold of that. tab 2.
It's okay.
That was one of the documents you were supplied with. At clause or section 6.7 of that document, just wanted to remind you about the text there. .7 refers to flying embers and the phenomenon that they can come from wildfire in remote grasslands, travel for kilometres, land on combustible materials. During times when bushfires are in the immediate area, a heightened awareness is required to detect the landing of them and put the spot fires out. Now, that policy was in place as at February 2014. That shows an acknowledgement in the risk assessment process, albeit not a full-blown safety assessment, an acknowledgement of the risk posed by external bushfire threats, doesn't it?
In part. What is missing, I believe, is where it could land and what happens when it lands.
Yes, but it says that one should put out spot fires. It doesn't say one shouldn't bother if they're in a particular part of the mine or not in another part of the mine.
No, that's correct, but it doesn't also assess the risk where the high-risk areas are.
I understand that. The reference in your statement towards the end about black swans, as you've explained it, is preparing for the unexpected or the rare event. We've heard a lot of evidence, in particular from the representatives of WorkSafe, about weighing that consideration against the cost and sometimes the disproportionate costs of controls or mitigating steps. Professor Cliff, when this fire was still burning, I believe, you gave a press interview to ABC Science in which you were asked for your opinion about some of the scientific aspects in terms of combustion and burning of brown coal. Do you recall that?
Not off the top of my head, but I may have done, yes.
Okay. And you're quoted by the ABC as saying, the current fires are caused by exceptional circumstances. They've mined brown coal in Victoria for over 100 years and it's generally done very safely. It's only under these extreme conditions when huge bushfires are raging close to the coal that the usual safety controls won't work. Do you recall making that comment?
I could have said that, yes.
And you say you could have said it.
Yes.
It's presumably a view you hold.
Yes, it is.
I have no further questions for Professor Cliff.
No one else has any questions, and I have no re-examination for Professor Cliff. So if he could be excused, I understand Ms Richards wants to raise a matter briefly before we adjourn for the evening.
So there are two matters that I'd like to raise before we finally adjourn this evening. The first is an outline of our final day of evidence tomorrow. We do have a lot to get through, so I do propose that we start at 9:30 with a view to using that extra half an hour in the morning. We have Rod Incoll, who has been here all day in the hope of being reached, but we will start tomorrow morning with him. We received a statement of Mr Prezioso yesterday evening, and it is necessary to ask him to answer a few questions, but I will be very brief with him tomorrow. Then Mr Graham, the asset manager of Hazelwood, has made himself available to give evidence tomorrow, although we have no statement from him, and Mr Lapsley will be returning as the final witness. So I do anticipate we will get through that evidence tomorrow, but it may be a longish day.
So there was a question of Mr Lapsley.
Yes, Mr Lapsley will be the final witness, yes. The other matter that I want to address is the course of events that has perhaps led to some expressions of vexation by myself and Mr Rosen about the way in which information has been provided, and concern expressed by Ms Doyle that there was some unfairness. And I thought it would be worthwhile at this stage just to set out the series of events and what information was requested and what information was provided, so that there is no suggestion that anyone's been unfair to anyone else. In the early stages of the inquiry on the 24th of April, the Secretariat wrote to the solicitors for GDF Sewers asking for some certain background information. A very helpful letter was provided dated the 2nd of May that set out a whole range of background information and provided 3 folders of documents. In relation to occupational health and safety, the letter said, major mine fire has been assessed by the mine as a major mining hazard under the OHS regulations as an incident with the potential to cause or which poses a significant risk of causing more than one death. Pursuant to Regulation 5.3.23 of the OHS regulations, the mine has conducted a comprehensive and systematic safety assessment of major mine fire as a major mining hazard, and there was a reference to tab 26. And the documents behind tab 26 in the folders that were provided were what we now have been referring to as the bow tie diagram and the various control measures, a thick bundle of control measures that sit behind that bow tie diagram. Also on the 24th of April, a summons was served on GDF Sewers requiring production of various documents, including a series of documents that are required by Part 5.3 of the relevant OHS regulations that apply to mines. And those are set out in paragraphs 10 to 14 of the summons, which I tendered this morning as Exhibit 77. Documents were produced in answer to the summons on the 9th of May with, again, a very thorough explanatory letter that accompanied those documents. And in relation to items 10 to 14 of the summons, documents were produced which included the GHD reports of 2009, the draft GHD report of 2009 and the 2004 reports that have been tendered today, and also some minutes from 2012, without any context being given, as one would expect when documents are produced in answer to a summons. Also on the 9th of May, the Secretariat requested from GDF Sewers a statement from Mr Graham, the asset manager, covering a whole range of issues to do with mitigation and prevention. And that letter is Annexure 2 to Mr Faithfull's statement that was tendered this morning. And one of the things that was requested, in addition to some information about the fire service policy and code of practice and its various iterations, was to identify Hazelwood's other principal plans and policies for mitigating the risk of fire and responding to fires within the mine. We expected that the response to that request would include reference to relevant occupational health and safety policies. Mr Graham has not provided a statement to the inquiry. We have received statements from a range of other witnesses, Mr Dugan, Mr Harkins, Mr Faithfull, Mr Palmier and just last night Mr Prezioso, each of whom addresses some of the aspects of that letter that we sent on the 9th of May, although we would say not all of them. The only reference to occupational health and safety policies and procedures was in Mr Harkins' second statement at paragraphs 33 through to 36, which is in very general terms and does not annex or refer to any documents. Certainly didn't refer to the draft GHD report from 2009, nor does it refer to the 2004 documents that some reliance has been placed on this week. Nor was there any attempt to put any of those documents into context or explain how the document, the bow tie diagram that we were initially provided with, had come into being. In light of the absence of any witness evidence about the health and safety policies that regulate mine fire, Council Assisting proceeded on the basis of the advice in the initial letter of the 2nd of May that the bow tie diagram and the accompanying control measures represent a comprehensive and systematic safety assessment of major mine fire as a major mining hazard. Now, it's been put by GDF in the course of this week that there is more to the story, and it's entitled to put that, but that is the way the information has come to light. So I'm sorry to do that at the very end of a long day, but I am stung by the suggestion that there's been any unfairness in that.
Ms Doyle want to say anything further?
No, my reaction,
In relation to unfairness, was a suggestion to Professor Cliff while he was in the box that there had been a recent production of documents that he'd been deprived of. The witness has quite properly accepted that that is not the way that he understood it as the recipient, and he's diligently looked at the additional information. That has cured the latent unfairness to my client. Ms Richards' description today, I think, underscores another factor, which is that people at the mine have been working full-time on the fire and now full-time on this inquiry. You will have seen them coming and going with bundles of documents. They have worked assiduously to respond to all of the summonses. If there was a misunderstanding in the way in which 8 volumes of materials were produced, and as it turns out, one part of the system management manual was omitted, we of course apologise, but we think it's perfectly explicable in the fast-moving inquiry that the staff have been responding to.
Yes, well, I think it's appropriate that both of you have spoken and on the record as to those matters, but I don't think at this stage it's necessary to take it any further. Yes, we'll adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow morning.